Welcome back to the Outlet Podcast. I'm Gabe.
And I'm Eric.
Thank you all for joining us this Friday. We got a lot in store.
So today I want to start talking about not necessarily any events or, sort of current news stories, because I feel like we've sort of talked about those, and this week is a good week for sort of taking a little rest stop,
Sure.
taking a breather, taking a pause from all of the insane stuff that's happening in our world.
It can cloud your thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of taking a step back and looking at, our sort of the broad answers that we have for our questions as a society. Are they the right answers? And do they really live up to what they promise to live up to, right? And I want to talk specifically about markets, because markets are... first of all, it's a word that a lot of people refer to, yet I feel like a lot of people misuse. And speaking specifically about politics, I feel like the word markets has been politicized and mischaracterized in a way that has sort of clouded what markets really do in our society and where they work best within our society. So before I get into my conception of markets, and I'll do that pretty extensively, I want to get your conception on markets.
Sure.
Because I'm sure you have an opinion on the word, right? Whether it be positive or negative, and I want to sort of hear what you think.
Sure.
What role do markets play in the world, and specifically America? Because markets and the word market is very much a buzzword here in America.
Yeah.
It's usually associated with the right people that lean more libertarian and believe in less government intervention in the economy.
So I feel a little bit more qualified than I would have maybe a year ago, because recently I've been interested in the stock market, and keep in mind I'm still a beginner in all that stuff. There's a lot of technical work that I don't fully understand yet, and I don't think many people do. But yeah, so my conception of markets. So my conception of markets comes from one video, really, that I thought was very brilliant. It was by Ray Dalio and his conception of markets. And he says a market is a collection of companies within a certain area. So there are many, many markets that make up the broader market throughout the United States. And so you could say, well, there's a market of plumbers, and there's a group of plumbers in America, and all those plumbers in their separate companies make up the plumbing market in America. You can think of it as one part of the American economy. And same goes for tech, which is a large market. Apple, Microsoft, whatever. Those big companies all together make up a large market, a part of the broader market. And so all these companies are hopefully turning a profit and hopefully pushing the broader market up in a straight line. And through that straight line, you have a long-term debt cycle, right, and a short-term debt cycle with just the daily ups and downs. And with the stock market, all the prices of stocks are based off of supply and demand, and so that also plays a huge role in the prices of the stocks and how they function. But on a broad scale, the markets are the broader market is built up of many, many small companies that are all you can categorize by what they do: plumbers, tech, whatever, painters, engineers, and they all are a part of the larger United States economy, or even larger, you could say, the global market. So that's a very basic definition
of markets, right?
Sure.
And I don't know. I want to sort of take a look at what two different ideas of what markets are, and sort of distinguish between them, and sort of talk to you about which one is sort of in place in our country right now, and which one should we try to adopt, right? And both ideas are sort of rooted in the idea of efficiency, and that markets are an efficient way of ordering our society. And sort of the classic example to illustrate this, given by American economists, is the disparity between the American economy and the economy of the Soviet Union. And this was used as an example to promote free market economies, or supposedly free market economies like the U.S. And that was because the U.S. was able to produce things much more efficiently and at a much higher rate than an economy that was centrally planned like the USSR or Mao's China. And I think that generally that idea is sound. That a centrally planned economy is less efficient than a market-based economy. And I think that the country that best illustrates that is China. And I know that's my favorite country to bring up.
Sure.
But I think that if you look at the transition between Maoist China, where it was a Soviet-style centrally planned country, where there was no free enterprise, there was no free trade, it was all under the umbrella of the Central Party. However, under Deng Xiaoping, one of Mao's successors, he started to transition the country into the direction of more a freer market. Now, did the CCP still have massive control over the country and the economy?
Yes.
Absolutely, and they remain that they hold on to that control today. But that transition has led to the transition from a state-controlled, centrally planned economy to a more market-based economy into more of a mixed area. Has led to an explosion in the productivity of the Chinese economy and an explosion in the per capita wealth of everyone in China.
And it stems from how when you have a very centralized market where it's controlled by the state, it's hard for the state to allow productivity.
Yeah.
Because they have to oversee so much, and it's inefficient for them to have to make all the decisions for every company. So yeah, it's inefficient in that way.
Right, and that is where the idea of a market really stems from. Is that instead of having, like, let's draw an example, right? New York City is this massive metropolis that there's millions of people that live there. Everyone lives drastically different lives. They consume different things. Some people need $1,000 suits. Some people just need a bagel for breakfast. Yet every day, enough supplies get into New York City to feed, to clothe, to entertain, to liquor up all those people, right? And it's about the right amount. Pretty much anyone that wants something in New York can have access to it if they have the money. It is an expensive city.
For sure.
But imagine if we tried to centrally plan that. Imagine if we tried to get a committee together and plan and organize the economic activities of New York City.
Yeah, there'd be a huge shortage.
We need 1 million bottles of vodka, and we
Sure.
need a new shipment of Ottomans, and we're out of rugs in Harlem, so we need to get those up there. It would be chaos, and there's no way that a central group would be able to plan and orchestrate that level of economic activity.
Absolutely.
So in that way, I think that the pro-market stance is correct, right? That having a centrally planned, centrally controlled system
is
inefficient. However, I think that market advocates fail to realize that New York in its current state is not a free market system. It is not the absolute free market that comes in and blesses New York with its truckfuls of goods and ships full of food, right? In reality, it's a much more mixed system, a system where government and the market work in cooperation with each other in order to provide those goods to the people of New York. And now this is where I want to sort of pose a question to you, Gabe, and to
Sure.
everybody in the audience. Is using markets as our answer for questions in society the best answer to the extent that it is used today? And now that's basically a complicated way of saying that we use markets to answer questions that should be answered using other means, right? And a basic example of that is healthcare, for example, right? That by allowing markets to provide healthcare, they have artificially inflated the prices, and they have actually moved away from efficiency. They've moved in the direction of overinflation and overproduction and the draining of the American people through their wallets.
So is the market a answer to hard questions such as how should we maintain the health of American citizens?
Right, exactly. So I think that using the market and looking at the market as the end all be all for answers for societal questions has failed in the past and will continue to fail in the future.
That's not to say it isn't a good answer for many of the problems, for sure.
Yeah. That's and that's that sort of gray area we're trying to figure
Absolutely,
out,
yeah.
right?
Where's the line?
Where's that line? Where is it applicable, and where should we find other alternatives?
Sure.
And I don't know. I think that generally, in terms of regulating overall economic activity, the market does an okay job, and I think that in terms of seeking out which products are the best and which products serve the needs of the consumer the best, the market does a relatively good job. Now, does it have its faults? Clearly, if there's 3 brands that monopolize a certain market, then those 3 brands is what we have to choose from. However, I think that when we use the market to answer questions of basic human needs, that is where we often fall short, and that is where we often develop broad societal problems and where we fail our fellow members of society. For example, right now we use the market to answer questions of homes, right? Now, there is some government part in that industry, right? We do have Section 8 housing where people who are underprivileged can have access to housing, but that program does not house nearly enough people as it should, and those houses are of significantly lower quality than houses provided by the private market.
Sure.
So I think that housing is another area where we need to reevaluate our answer to that societal question of how do people live? Where do people live? How do you get a house, right?
Yeah, it's a very, very complicated question.
And it's a very complicated issue,
and
right?
it's all about economic policy, right? What we're really talking about is how much should we regulate within an economy. And, that varies, right? So, you can think of during the Industrial Revolution where we had child labor. Like, we figured out, well, child labor is wrong and we shouldn't have that. Well, that was a part where the market had a part of the market was extraordinarily efficient. Now, you can't argue that child labor isn't efficient. It's very efficient.
I think from the perspective of one company, right? From the perspective of the capitalist, yes, it's efficient. You pay these kids half the price of an adult, and they churn out 3/4 of the amount, right? That's a
efficient.
solid profit margin, right? But if you look at it from a societal perspective, is it more efficient to spend for a child to spend their first, a significant portion of their childhood in a factory sewing shoes?
Absolutely.
Or is it better for them to spend that time
in education,
in a school, so that they can provide more for the society
in the future? Sure.
In the sum total of their life, I would say that an education is a better route. So that's an example of the market being a good answer for one person and one part of society, but not for society as a whole. And so that's one of those areas where I think it's important that we prioritize our society as a whole over the
gains of one company, sure.
one person, one family. And what I think the best metric to sort of draw this line, and I want to hear your critique on this, is that if we say that the market's one determining goal, and the best thing that the market does is make sure that the goods provided to consumers and the goods provided between companies meet the needs of the end buyer the best, right? And tied into that is price inflation and potential monopolization, right?
Yes.
And potential oligopoly, right?
Sure.
So that's sort of the trade-off you get, right? Is that, if we want coffee in our society to be provided so that everybody gets the best coffee for their consumer needs, then you have a free market coffee system like we do now, where you have Peet's and you have Starbucks and you have local coffee houses, all of which provide coffee and all of which compete, and that allows people to choose with their wallets what is the best coffee for them. A lot of people like Starbucks, and that's why Starbucks is one of the biggest food chains
Absolutely.
in the world. And that's our way of saying this is a product that I like. However, if we want any other sort of answer for a societal question, we need to turn to non-market solutions. So for example, if we look at healthcare, for example, if we say that the negative effects of a private healthcare market outweigh the positive effects of you getting, nice fast healthcare and slick insurance websites and, nice fast doctor visits, if we say that the negatives of, hundreds of thousands of people going without the care they need and thousands of people dying because of, a lack of access to healthcare, if we say that those negatives outweigh the positives of, nice short lines and big fancy hospitals, right? And, lots and lots of drugs being shoveled into your small Appalachian town. If we say that those negatives outweigh the positives, then we can choose another system for determining who gets healthcare, how they get healthcare, where that healthcare is provided.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the system to sort of, I said I wasn't going to talk about current events, but to tie it into current events, if you look at the countries that have answered that question differently, countries that have socialized universal healthcare system, like Canada, France, the UK, Italy, their COVID numbers, when the U.S. peaked, they peaked as well, and then they continued to drop down in a nice hill pattern. However, if you look at the U.S.'s numbers, we started to descend a little bit. However, we've jumped right back up to those peak levels that we were at before.
That's right.
And I do think that, obviously it's a very complicated question of, what role does our healthcare industry play in that, in the spread of the disease. However, I do think that if you look at the American healthcare system from a broad macro perspective, we can see that it is failing its duties, it is not living up to its promise, and there are better systems out there that should be implemented from a utilitarian perspective, from a financial perspective, and from a just a moral perspective.
Absolutely.
That people dying unnecessarily is bad, right?
Bad.
That's bad, and we should prevent that.
Yeah, and one death is worth changing the whole system if it's that inefficient.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, you talked a lot about healthcare, but taking a little bit more of a broader perspective, if you look, throughout history, especially during the Gilded Age in America, there were a lot of monopolies that came up, and that was because we had such a laissez-faire economic system where do whatever you want, make as much money as you want, and that's that. We're not going to regulate anything. Yeah. And we saw that was hurting the American people, and it was hurting the politics as well, because you have these massive owners of companies like Rockefeller, who had a huge hand in politics.
Yeah, definitely.
And that still has continued to today. To an extent. But yeah, so what did we do? Well, Teddy Roosevelt busted up the trust and said you can't have those anymore because it's wrong for the people.
Yeah.
No, that's just one instance, and I'll speak about healthcare in a sec. But I do think that the market has a substantial role in the way that the American people live, and and many of them don't actually see it, but they are a part of the system, and they have to go along with it. Like they can't well, of course there are programs like Medicaid or whatever, but healthcare is mostly privatized, and people have to go to a specific company and get their health insurance there.
Yeah, and shovel out way too much money
exactly
to do that.
Right?
Yeah,
I mean you can think of,
if you compare what the average American pays for healthcare, it's about 3 times as much as what the average British person pays.
Sure, and then someone would say very quickly that, well, my healthcare is better than Canada's. But again, should there? The question we're really trying to answer is: should there be markets that are completely centralized by the government, such as healthcare, and should we move away from that?
Yeah.
The privatization of healthcare.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that once again we got to get back to that metric that I mentioned earlier, right? Is the way we want to operate this industry to provide the consumer with the what is best and most readily appealing for that consumer, right? Is that the way we want to shape this industry? For certain industries, the answer is yes, right? Other industries, however, we may want to take a hard look at that and really rethink that and reshape that. Now, does that mean that we have to completely privatize every aspect of healthcare? Every medical equipment manufacturer, every drug company? Not necessarily. However, I do think that we need to begin experimentation with those kinds of systems so that we can flesh out what a universal healthcare system looks like in America with the American healthcare context.
Yeah. And you get people like Martin Shkreli who pop up every once in a while.
Well, and the issue right now is that by shaping our health system using a market, not only do Shkreli's pop up every once in a while, and they don't just sneak in every once in a while. Our system is designed to reward and incentivize Shkreli's, right, and
Yeah.
other people like him.
You can make more money if you
can
raise
make
the
more
price
money,
of this drug
and-
8,000%
Exactly,
or whatever.
exactly. And doing that is a smart business move. And if you don't do it, maybe some other company will do it, or the stockholders will fire you because you're not willing to do it and hire the next person that is willing to do it. And
Yeah.
and that's the real problem with having a market-based healthcare system, is that people are incentivized to do things that hurt the American people as a whole. And so you get this power structure that is very important, right? That is crucial. We're not just talking about, ice cream stores or candy shops. We're talking about, the line that separates people from life and death, right? We've structured that in a way that puts a very small group of people's interests above the interests of the American people as a whole. And so we've replicated the same situation that we saw in the Gilded Age, where the interests of Carnegie and Stanford and JP Morgan Chase and Rockefeller, though their interests of them and their families were put above the interests of millions of Americans. And that's why you saw the bad conditions of the Gilded Age. I think that is exactly the place where government should step in and restructure that power structure so that massive amount of power, right? Standard Oil or the Chase banking empire or Union Pacific Railroad or whatever company you want to point at, take that massive pool of power and point it from benefiting one person back to benefiting the American people. That's exactly the role that government should play
and
in
the
terms of
question is, how do you
answering our questions.
Sure. And the question is, how do you maintain efficiency and still allow those companies to exist, although not as powerful as they could be if you didn't regulate them? How do you maintain them? Because the worry is, okay, well, what if we do make healthcare run by the government? Well, my healthcare is going to suffer. How much is it going to suffer? It's going to become less efficient.
Okay, well, so let's really take a look at that, right? So right now, the American healthcare system is built on overcharging people, right? If you go into the hospital and if you go into the ER room and you think you have your pancreas is bursting, but nothing has happened, you will still get hit with a large bill, right? Yeah. And if you get some small scar or something and you go into the hospital to deal with it, then you're going to get hit with a large
Definitely.
bill.
I mean, this
right?
is kind of close to home too, because when my younger sisters, my mom had twins, and they were premature, and they were, I think, 6 weeks early. So pretty early, and they had to go to the neonatal center, which is basically where they take premature babies and try and nurture them to, make sure that they're healthy. They were in there for 1 week. The bill for both the babies in the neonatal was $400,000. Now, granted, my dad did have good health insurance; they did cover a large sum of it, but he still had to pay a lot of money.
Right, and that's enough to buy a house.
Oh yeah,
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 more than enough, right? And there are thousands and thousands of those cases that happen every day. So yes, from one perspective, if you have enough money to spend on your healthcare, you're going to get great healthcare here in America. You're going to get the best doctors, the best plastic surgeons, the best whatever you want, right? So if you're in that upper crust, right, you have great healthcare. But if you can't afford that surgery, or if you can't afford to go to regular checkups every 6 months, and you can't afford to have that little lump on your back looked at, then guess what? You have some of the worst healthcare in the world.
Sure, and you have people who are afraid of getting healthcare, who are afraid of going to hospitals too,
because they know that they're going to get hit with that bill. I personally know people that refuse to have an ambulance called for them when they needed an ambulance because they know they're going to have to pay $2,000,
which you shouldn't want to have.
Exactly. In any functioning society, we should provide for the people that need that help. So instead of looking at American healthcare from the perspective of an incredibly wealthy person saying that, listen, yeah, if you have money to blow, American healthcare is great. It's efficient. It's nice. It's clean. All these nice hospitals and cutting edge technology. But if you take a step back and if you average out the quality of healthcare that Americans as a whole receive, guess what? It's pretty bad, because there are tons and tons of people, millions of people that don't receive the healthcare they need. Right now, that's not efficient to me. That's not a good healthcare system, and it's not something we should fight to uphold and retain.
Sure. Okay, so let's go down to the premise. Let's talk about the premise real
yeah.
quick. So the premise is this, that healthcare is a basic human right. Now, if you agree on that premise, then that means the state should provide that. It should provide healthcare. It's a basic human need that people should be treated with their health, not necessarily equally, but at least treated. And when you have these cases, such as people not wanting to go to the to call an ambulance because they don't have enough money, that doesn't seem like you're treating that basic human right properly.
Yeah,
all people should be treated. Now, granted, if you do go to a hospital, they have to treat you,
right,
whether or not you have insurance.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean they won't slap a $100,000 bill to your visit.
Exactly. And so.
So yeah, there's a lot of problems with
So
the
many
healthcare system right now, and that's one of the reasons why I do agree with Bernie Sanders on this. Is that healthcare is a basic human right, and the state should provide it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And so let's.
And it does make my blood boil when you have these Martin Shkreli's who pop up and raise the interest, or not interest rate, but raise the price of the EpiPen by 8,000%.
Yeah, exactly. And you have people with diabetes rationing their insulin, taking half as much as they need because it costs so much, and they have to choose between their bodies and their rent. I mean, the fact that is a choice that an American has to face is immoral and is something that we need to change right now. But let's sort of take a step back and really take a look at what that sort of system would look like. Would that mean that every single healthcare, every hospital is run by a centrally planned agency in Washington?
Sure.
Does that mean that every all the Pfizers and all the McKessons are run by the Drug Committee of America, right? Not necessarily. Obviously there have been countries that have implemented centrally planned healthcare systems, right? The Soviet Union for one, and guess what? Their healthcare system was better than America's. Just basing like on flat metrics in terms of the number of checkups every citizen receives, the number of doctors per capita, the infant mortality rate, the basic metrics that people use to judge a healthcare system. Guess what? The Soviet Union was better.
I didn't know that.
But moving on, and I'm not trying to advocate for that system. I'm just saying that guess what? It's been tried and it has worked relatively well.
Sure.
Now, was it perfect? Obviously not. But I'm just saying that we shouldn't judge before we've tried. But I think that America's easiest route and most viable route towards a universal healthcare system would be sort of a mixed economy style industry, where
the rich can still get good healthcare.
The rich can still get good healthcare. However, the American government acts as the American people's union in terms of negotiating for healthcare. So guess what? If you want to sell insulin to the American people, if you're going to charge $600 a vial, we're boycotting you. And right now, that boycott has no power, because if one diabetic or two diabetics, even 1,000 diabetics boycott this company, all the rest of the American diabetics still have to buy from that company. Yeah. However, if every diabetic in America can boycott that company through the government, now the bargaining power is in favor of the American people, and we can reverse the incredible power difference that is currently there, and greatly reduce drug costs. And to sort of further illustrate that, how that would work is, right now, when companies buy healthcare for their employees, they're able to get it cheaper than employees would be able to get on their own, because they're buying health insurance for 1,000 people or 100,000 people. And that means that those health insurance companies have to give it to them for cheaper, because you're basically buying in bulk, right? The same way if you buy at Costco, you can probably get it then at 7-Eleven. And imagine if we replicate that with all the people in America. Now, all of a sudden, not only are you just bargaining on, not only is that person bargaining on behalf of 1,000 people or 10,000 people at a company, they're bargaining on behalf of 350 million people. You would be able to reduce the prices of healthcare by a significant amount.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that all of the companies involved in the healthcare umbrella, all of the medical equipment manufacturers, all of the drug manufacturers, everyone that makes gloves, everyone that makes masks, everyone that employs nurses through a temp agency, right? Do all of them have to be centralized and nationalized? Not necessarily, because that is one thing that the market does well, is efficiency and competition. So if we still want the cheapest prices, if we still want to reduce the price of healthcare for the American people, now this means that under this system they wouldn't be paying for it out of their wallets simply through their taxes. We would still want to allow some degree of competition within the healthcare industry, so that the company that is able to produce this drug most efficiently, right? They will be the ones that provide the drug. Right? The ones that are able to provide this piece of medical equipment for the least amount per unit, they're going to be the ones that provide it to the American people and to the hospitals. And that's one thing that the market does well, right? So that's what this is all about, is finding that balance between the market and between the interests of the people. So if we, break down the healthcare industry into these little questions, right? Where we can look at one question that says, where should a hospital get its ventilators, right? Where should a hospital buy its ventilators from? Where should it ship it from? Is it buying it from Lebanon? Is it buying it from Germany? Is it buying it from Ohio? Where are these ventilators coming from? What company is providing them? In that case, the market is a relatively good way to answer that question, because what is best for that hospital is actually best for the people.
Yeah,
right?
because
those interests are aligned,
sure.
right? Because the cheaper they can get that ventilator, the easier, the cheaper it will be to provide healthcare for the end consumer.
Yeah.
However, if we look at the question of who gets healthcare, right? Who is able to receive a triple bypass surgery? Who is able to receive the care that they need? The market and the people's interests, right? The answers provided to that question do not line up. And in that case, that is where the people need to stand up and ensure that the answer provided aligns with the interests of the people. So there's where this disparity is, right? If the answer provided by the market and the solution provided by the market is what's best for the people, let it be. However, if the market solution hurts people and the total amount of suffering caused by it is greater than the total amount of benefit caused by it, then we must turn to another solution. Yeah. So just to wrap up on healthcare, that would mean that, listen, even if you are incredibly poor, you make no money at all, you can have the healthcare you need. If you're diabetic, you can have your insulin, right? Because you are an American and you deserve that. And because we have so much money and so much wealth in our country, that we should be able to do the basic thing of helping people stay alive when they deserve to be. And to sort of loop back a little bit back to housing, and how that's another area where the purely market answer for that question is looking like it's failing in our society right now. That would be another area where I think that more government intervention would be beneficial. Now, would this government intervention be as extensive as healthcare? I don't think that would be the ideal system.
Sure. Yeah.
Would we have a national housing database where everybody goes in there and then you get allotted a house by some committee in Washington?
No.
I don't think that would be the best way.
Very inefficient too.
And that's because we once again need to look at what kind of answer, what kind of solution does the market provide, and does that line up with the people's interests? And in the case of housing, the way most people buy their houses is, I want to live where based on my metrics, right? If a certain person loves location, right, and they want to live right by the beach, but they're willing to live in a 1-bedroom apartment with a bad toilet and broken plumbing, then we can allow them to do that. It is best for them to have the freedom to make that choice, instead of saying you get to live in Tower Block 7 in the 4th District outside of
like
New
a
York,
commune
right?
or something.
Yeah. And in that way, the market provides a good solution, right? Allowing people to prioritize what they like in a home. Maybe people are willing to spend 80% of their annual income on their home. Maybe some people really like to go on trips, and so they want to live in a bad home, but go on good vacations every year. So in that case, it's beneficial for the people as a whole to have the freedom to choose. Yeah. However, when you look at the more niche question of should people have housing or not, the market fails drastically. Right? Because the market says, yeah, if you have X amount of dollars, and if you're able to pay, $1,000 a month for rent, or if you're able to pay, $200,000 a year to buy this home, in that case, the market's answer to that question is not aligned with the people's best interests.
Well, I mean, there are low income housing.
There is low income housing,
And you
right?
can
And so that's an example of our society and our government already recognizing the failure in the market there, recognizing that we do need to supplement the market's solution for housing, and we do need to play our part and do what is best for the people. However, because there are still people without houses and still, don't have that privilege or that right, then I think that is a clear example and a clear illustration of how our society has not gone far enough in our promise to give people housing.
Yeah,
and we have
we've
not fulfilled our promise to the American people
Sure.
to give them the right to life, liberty, and happiness. Because if you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, and you don't know where you're going to sleep tonight, you don't have the ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness.
Definitely. Yeah, so giving kind of a practical example of this, at my church, there's a priest there. His name is Father Anthony. He's a very, very brilliant man. And down the street from the church, there was a whole low-income housing project where there are many houses set up for people who couldn't make enough money to, go out and buy a nice fancy house in the area. Scripture Ranch is a very costly, the houses in Scripture Ranch are expensive, and the houses all throughout San Diego are very expensive.
Yeah, we do
houses.
live in California. It's all just pretty bad.
It's very expensive. Property tax is huge too. But anyways, so continuing, he brought this up in one of his homilies on a Sunday and said the government is planning on selling the whole complex of the low-income housing complex, is planning on selling the complex to these savvy investors who wanted to buy the land so that they could set up actual housing, not just low-income housing. And he asked the people to go to the council building in San Diego and protest it. And so that's what they did. Well, it turns out that the government brokered the deal with the investors, and they leveled the whole low-income housing, and all the people who were living in the low-income housing had to leave. And now they're setting up these, big, beautiful houses that are going to sell for who knows how much money. But what it did is it
Displaced
displaced a lot of
families,
people,
yeah.
and for what reason?
And for whose benefit? Who reaps the reward? I'm sure a councilman in the city council got a nice hefty campaign donation, but ultimately it was those private investors that were in that position because they had a fat stack of cash in their back pocket, right?
Yep. So that's just a very clear example of when the market has failed in providing people with the right to housing.
Right. And in that specific case, I feel like from a utilitarian perspective, that was a bad thing that happened, right? The people that benefited, sure, some people got new homes. They paid a lot for them, but they got those new homes. They benefited to some degree.
Sure. You just think about the people
they would have been able to find other homes.
That's right.
However, the people that benefited the most, those rich people, the investors, the real estate brokers, right? However, the people that suffered, low-income people already in a bad position, had their houses torn down and might
displaced.
not have been able to find other housing, or maybe had to move out of San Diego.
Yeah, so this is all based on a very utilitarian perspective, right?
We should do what is best for the greatest amount of people.
Exactly. And those low-income houses helped more people than the new houses that they had set up, which helped a small amount of people.
Right.
And so it's based on this utilitarian perspective. We should do the most good for the most amount of people. And if that's what your whole thesis on American business and American markets is based off of, is that we should do the most good for the most people, then yes, certainly the government should step in many markets in America where, especially healthcare, because, when a person is diabetic, they rely on insulin to live, right? They are completely dependent on those people who are providing them insulin. Yeah. Completely dependent. If they don't take insulin, they can die, right? And so for the government not to step in and say, okay, we're going to make sure you guys have to set this price for your insulin is beyond me. There's no reason why the government shouldn't step in and try and barter with the insurance, not barter, but have conversations with the people who provide insulin and say you can only set this price.
Yeah.
Because if you set, if you mark up the price 800%, then the people are going to suffer. It's beyond me that they don't do that already.
Yeah.
And you can apply this to many other markets in America too, housing, like you said.
Yeah. So this, that proposal you brought up I want to sort of take a brief look at it, because that is a basic model for government intervention into an industry that has been replicated all over the place, and specifically in housing, right? The idea that we should just staple the price to a certain level and make sure that that's the level that it's at, has been used especially in housing markets, right? And it's been called rent control, and it's famously been used in New York, where certain apartments are rent controlled, and the landlords are only able to charge X amount of dollars for rent in that apartment. And that's sort of a parallel way of government intervention, like you said.
Setting the prices.
Setting the price. You can only charge $50 for a vial of insulin. You can only charge $1,000 a month for this apartment. However, the classic economic critique of this sort of strategy is that reduces the long-term incentive for investing in that industry by investors. So if let's say let's take a New York block, right? It's in Midtown Manhattan, and if the free market decided the apartment prices, then the average apartment price would be $3,000 a month, right? Expensive apartments, middle of Manhattan, right? However, if the city decides to go in and implement rent control, then those apartments go for $1,500 a month. So they cut the price in half. So potential real estate investors, if looking at a market block, right, where the apartments are $3,000 a month, then they can calculate that and say that, listen, we can expect to make $3,000 a month, input inflation, right? So we can expect to make $3,000 a month for these 15 years that it would take, and within 15 years we can have paid off our investment and be making money on this building. However, at $1,500 a month, it'll take us 30 years, right, to pay off our initial investment in this building. So by capping the price of that product, the government is deterring potential investors and actually increasing the problem as a whole, which is a lack of housing, right? That's why housing is too expensive, is because there's not enough housing, right? And so by implementing rent control, you're only further exacerbating that problem. Now, do I understand why implementing rent control is done? Absolutely. I mean, when the price of housing skyrockets, people get displaced and neighborhoods get gentrified, and cities lose their soul, and people suffer. And I mean, I saw that in San Francisco growing up. I mean, when I was young, San Francisco, I was born into the transition, right? So I didn't see San Francisco at its peak in the 60s and 70s. However, it used to be a vibrant, artistic city full of interesting people that lived unconventional lifestyles. However, if you look at San Francisco right now, it's a tech hub full of people that make six figures, wear light blue or white button-down shirts and tuck them into their slacks, and they go to their work every day. And the city's changed drastically. And in some ways, that's been a boom, right? The GDP per capita has skyrocketed, but in many ways, San Francisco has lost a lot of what it had 40, 50 years ago. So I totally understand why rent control is implemented. However, I generally feel that tactic of price capping is a short-term solution that ends up exacerbating long-term problems. So I think that if the government and the people are faced with a rapid price increase, yes, price capping is an effective way to deter that short-term issue. However, it needs to be only used as a short-term solution, because if used as a long-term solution, it will only exacerbate that problem.
Sure.
And it needs to be complemented with other government strategies like funding public housing, right? So instead of capping the price of New York apartment blocks, simply taking money and spending it on more New York apartment blocks, right? And now that's also been done. I've been to the housing projects all across New York City. But that's a whole other issue, right?
Yeah, sure,
So
sure.
I think that when we look at what does government intervention look like, and how should we curtail the negative effects of markets, it's an incredibly nuanced issue, and more
Certainly.
government intervention does not equal better stuff, right?
Yeah.
We need to be very careful when implementing this government regulation and ensuring that we do not cause long-term problems down the road for future generations, and to ensure that we do uphold efficiency as one of the main goals of all of our
Absolutely.
systems.
Yeah, capitalism is very good at making good products.
Mhm.
It's very
Markets
good.
are.
Markets are, sure, but competition is very good at making sure that the person who provides the best service or good wins out. Right? Because people will use their wallets to decide that, right? That's why Starbucks is such a large, company is because many people like their coffee and they provide it efficiently. And Starbucks is, that's why they're successful.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why my dad has been able to make money for our family is because he has a business. He provides a service, which is guitar lessons, and people find his service efficient and good and better than the competition, so they spend their money there. And so many, almost, well, I don't want to say almost all, but so many systems, so many markets in America rely on having good products or services that outcompete their competitors. And that's why, we have so many, well, not necessarily right now because there's a lot of unemployment, but a lot of people who are employed is because they are a part of a system that is efficient and they keep providing. And to have a centralized government take control of all of those things would kill thousands and thousands of businesses instantly. And so there has to be clear ways that the government, first off, there has to be a reason why the government has to go into a business and change it in a certain way. But there has to be very careful dealings with the government and businesses, because if the government decides to go in and wipe away the entire system, it would destroy thousands of jobs and efficiency and all the efficiency within that business and the services or goods it provides.
Yeah. So I want to sort of take this opportunity because I'm seeing a good place for a segue here to talk about socialism, right?
That hasn't been brought up yet.
Yeah, it hasn't been brought up yet, right? Well, I think that the I don't know, the I guess it wasn't such a good transition I had in my head, but the line that a lot of Americans seem to draw in their heads is between laissez-faire free markets and absolute control of the economy, right? And that Democrats are closer to the USSR, and that Republicans are closer to Adam Smith laissez-faire economics, right? And that less government means more markets, and more private ownership means more markets, right? However, and in turn means more efficiency, right? And that private ownership is linked with efficiency, and efficiency is linked with private ownership. However, when I advocate for socialism and when I talk about socialism, I'm not advocating for government control or a centrally planned economy. I still believe in markets, and I value the efficiency that markets provide. However, I do believe that in a socialist country, markets will still very much play a role, and I'll get into that in a second. But generally, I think that the private ownership of companies and of the levers of our economy does not necessarily lead to efficiency, but it leads to a unequal society that is designed to produce unjust and unequal results. Right?
Well, how are those two things linked?
What do you mean?
Private ownership and efficiency. How are
efficiency,
those two
linked? Right? So a lot. That's one. A lot. I'm getting a little.
It's kind of a
flustered
difficult
here,
question,
right?
sure.
Yeah. A lot of people, when arguing against socialism, falsely conflate government control with socialism, right? And that people imagine that every company in America would just be owned by the state, right? And that GE would be owned by the president, and that my local bodega would also be owned by the president, right? However, it's in reality quite different, right? That it's actually on the opposite end of that scale, from complete private control, right, and absolute control of the economy to complete democratic control, where everybody has an equal share in the economy. If you imagine where capitalism is on that scale, it's actually closer to that sort of absolute monarchism of the economy, right? Where very few people have a large amount of control, and a large amount of people have very little control.
Yeah, that's the point of capitalism, is to try and outcompete your competitors,
right?
To be the absolute monarch.
So that's the crux, right? That people think that by having this private control, we're fueling competition, right? And that competition is the root cause for all of this stuff that we have around us. And without that competition, then we would not have all these consumer goods. And so there's sort of two issues that I have with that idea, right? And first, I'll start with laying out what sort of my alternative is and what socialism looks like in my head. And that's that all of these companies, instead of being controlled by and making decisions in the interest of one person or a small group of people like stockholders or a board of directors, instead, those decisions be made for the benefit of everybody that's involved in that enterprise, right? Now, there's different ways of implementing that sort of idea, whether it be direct democracy, right? If you run a store where you have 3 employees and it's you and just them 3, direct democracy might be a good idea, right? Where everybody is incredibly involved and knowledgeable about what goes on in the store because there's just 4 people there, and everybody does those splits everything up in quarters. Direct democracy might work well in that situation. However, if you look at Walmart, for example, direct democracy might not be the best because cashiers might not know about international trade the way executives do, and executives might not know about the most efficient way to design a cashier line the way cashiers do. So in that case, a representative government may be more efficient, may be more effective. However, in sum total, that sort of system would not eliminate the incentive for efficiency, because ultimately the incentive structure of the company would remain the same at a foundational level where everybody wants to make more money, right? And the system is designed to make more money. That would not fundamentally change. If you're working for a company and you know that you're going to make more money if the company makes money, you're going to do your best to make the company money because you know you're going to make more money, right?
Sure.
And that is sort of a shift in the direction of more efficiency away from our current system where most workers, if their wage or their salary is not directly tied to the profit and the efficiency of the company as a whole, they don't care, right? And
I know this,
and I speak from personal experience because I've worked minimum wage jobs.
Yeah. And I don't care about Five Guys and whether or not they turn a profit.
I don't care about Sprout stock going up or down. I don't care about how well management does.
Yeah.
So in that way, we would be moving in the direction of efficiency, right?
So you would say it'd be more efficient for the people to actually have their paychecks depend on the success of the company?
Exactly. And that's just one way that these companies could be structured. People could choose to simply get paid a wage or a salary and choose to invest all of the excess profits back into the company. That might be what this company decides to do, and there might be another company that decides to simply pay all of its profits directly out to the workers on a weekly basis, right? Now, this is where the market comes into play. Just because those two companies are controlled by their workers and they are structured democratically does not mean that the market doesn't make them compete. Those two companies are still competing. They both make wrenches or whatever. They both still have to compete for customers, right? People are still buying wrenches, and they still have to choose between these two companies. So that basic metric, that basic foundational structure remains the same, right? The market is still a major factor, and the market will decide which of those structures is better. Maybe the company that decides to pay its workers every single week and so that they can feel the direct bonuses of their hard work does better, and people decide to work way harder. Then the market has elevated and chosen that structure as a more efficient and a more effective structure than the alternative structure, right? So markets still very much play a role in my idea of a socialist economy. However, the difference that is made is that those decisions that are made and the metric by which efficiency and effectiveness is judged is not how much it benefits one person or 10 people or 1,000 people. It's how it benefits the people that are most intimately affected by the decisions of that company, right? The employees.
Sure. I mean, you think about where people spend the most time out of their day. Mm-hmm. It's usually at their job, right? That's usually where they spend the most time. So if you change the way that the job is structured, you change their livelihood, right, to an extent. And if you improve their working conditions by, making them more closely tied with their job and making their wages reflect their actual efficiency, then that would improve the livelihood of the people who are at the company itself.
Yeah. So it would improve efficiency overall. And that is the basic my idea of a basic model for what the market part of our economy should look like.
Sure.
Is that those decisions should be made for the benefit of the people most affected by those decisions.
Yeah, but again, I think the practical part of this is that you're taking power. Well, I mean, yeah, you could say power. You're taking power away from the people who actually own the company, right? And if you're going to actually implement it, it's going to be very, very difficult to take the power away from those CEOs, the board of directors, and try and give it back to the actual, cashiers, the laborers.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a long struggle to actually implement that system.
Yeah, and I think that I think that I'm sure coming out of our mouths, it sounds very abstract and sort of utopian.
Yeah, we got to keep it in the abstract.
But I think that that structure would not be so drastically different from what we experience now. I mean, a good chunk of people's work reality would largely remain the same. I mean, I would like to think that it would improve on the edges, but you would still go to work when you go to work, and you would still do your work, and you would still interact with your coworkers the same way. However, the decisions being made by the company hopefully would be in your benefit. And instead of and whenever there is a decision being made that pits the interests of the employees against the interests of the investors or the customer, this new restructured company would hopefully always side with the employees, and hopefully always prioritize their happiness and their needs above the needs of people that are less affected by that decision, or a smaller group of people that is affected by that decision.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the people who are affected by the decisions the most in a company are the actual laborers, because they're the largest part of the company, right? And yeah, I mean, you have a lot of companies where the owners are only doing well, of course, they're doing. That's why capitalism works the way it does, is because the owners of companies are doing whatever is in their best interest, and not necessarily caring about their laborers, right? And and you think about like the Industrial Revolution, right? That's why they had child laborers, because they didn't give a rip about their laborers. They only cared about turning a profit.
Yeah.
So what you're trying to do with the whole system is shift the incentives.
That's what it's about. So that, I mean, I know I harp on this a lot, but it's the ideal system is one that, if you put in the most cruel, greedy, horrible, immoral person into a position of power, they should be incentivized to make good utilitarian decisions, and it would be in their best interest to make those decisions in that way, right? So that you can get the most horrible, evil person, throw them in there, and they would still end up doing a good job because of how well you've structured that position of power.
Yeah.
So even if you get the worst boss, they still have to do something that's good for you, or else they'll get kicked out and they'll get fired.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what else to say about it.
Yeah.
It seems pretty sound.
We've talked it out at this point. So I'd like to transition to a new topic, right?
Sure.
The tech race that is currently going on, and is sort of taking a back seat in most people's minds. The tech race between China and America. Now, for the past century or so, America has benefited from a significant technological lead ahead of the rest of the world, and especially during the Cold War, we were on the cutting edge of, well, not space technology for the first chunk of it, but certainly military technology and information technology and a myriad of other technologies that have greatly benefited the world. And during that time, China was seen as a tech imitator and not a tech innovator. So tech products that came from China were stereotypically characterized as American ripoffs or copies of other foreign technology that were just badly made and produced at a much lower price, right? So if you bought a Chinese laptop instead of an American laptop, you could expect it to be half the price and half the quality. However, over the past decade or so, Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, the premier before him, have tried to change this, and they've tried to shift China's economy away from low-level manufacturing and low-skill manufacturing towards a economy based on consumption and innovation. And this is sort of done in order to avoid something called the middle income trap, where a country can rise out of the low-income region, right? They are no longer in poverty. However, they may become stuck in the middle between a high-income country and a low-income country. And very few countries have actually escaped that middle-income trap, right? Nigeria, for example. They're no longer a poor country, but they're having a hard time transitioning all the way to a wealthy country,
Sure.
right? Ireland is an example of a country that did do that, right? They went from being a poor country to being a wealthy country, right? Without being stuck in the middle. Sorry, a little tirade there. But
Sure.
but so China's leadership and the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party have tried to sort of revolutionize China's tech industry so that they are no longer simply following the lead of other countries, but so that they are actually, being cutting edge and coming up with new technology in order to be less dependent on outside companies, as well as make some money, right?
Sure.
And one strategy that they've done in order to do so, that I feel like is a good illustration of how a government can work in cooperation with a market in order to provide the best goods and innovate in a good way, is the way that China has interacted with its tech companies, right? Now, these are, domestic tech companies that were mostly founded and grew up in Shenzhen, right, which is a tech hub near Hong Kong and Guangzhou in the southern part of the country.
Okay.
These are companies like Huawei, ZTE, Tencent, in a long list of other companies, Baidu, Alibaba,
Sure.
a lot of companies, right? And they're very profitable, very, very large. And what the government will do in order to sort of guide and lead these companies in the way that the CCP feels is the best direction for the country is they will provide goals and incentives for these companies to innovate in certain areas. And the biggest area of innovation that China has pushed towards is AI. And so what the Chinese government will do through the use of banks is they will promise a large loan to whatever tech company meets a certain AI goal. So China could say, listen, we're going to give, $1 billion in loans to whatever company develops a fully AI run restaurant, right? And the first one to that finish line gets that nice check, right? And so that is a direct way of the government leading the direction of the tech companies and innovating in a way that is able to surpass American companies in many ways. Because American companies aren't given that massive carrot at the end of the road to make those broad leaps in AI that might not have practical applications yet.
That's
right?
interesting.
So for American companies to be willing to spend $500 million on a AI research project, they would need to see greater than $500 million of profits pretty much right out of the gate or within a few years of producing that product. Chinese companies, on the other hand, don't need to see that result at all. They know that if they simply produce a good AI product, it doesn't even matter if it's applicable in any way for consumers or industry at all.
They're still going to get
because they're going to get $1
check.
billion,
Yeah.
right? And so that is a way that China has been able to really push its technology sector and sort of become the cutting edge industries, drum up these cutting edge industries within China, right? And the biggest examples are AI, like I said before, facial recognition, electric cars. I gotta say AI again because it is such a varied and broad field that can be applied to so many different areas, right? So not only is China leading the edge in military AI, but they're leading it in civilian AI and industrial AI and logistics AI and overall supply AI, right? And one of the main reasons they're able to excel so much in this field is because China does not value data privacy. China does not have any sort of legal protection, or, it does technically have it in its constitution, but practically, the Chinese government does not respect individuals' right to data privacy. So what they do is they give these state companies or these state-connected domestic Chinese companies like Huawei, like ZTE, access to all of the data of all of the people in the country.
Jeez, man.
Which is an edge that no American company and no foreign company has.
If we tried to do that in America, there'd be a massive lawsuit.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Google and Facebook certainly have access to plenty of data.
Oh, yeah.
However, they don't have access to the data of every single action of over 1 billion people, all living in this country, right? That is the access that Alibaba and Huawei and ZTE and these other Chinese tech giants have. So they have this massive pool of data that outweighs the American pool of data by a significant amount. And not only is it that 1 or 2 companies have that pool of data, but all the companies that are sanctioned by the Chinese state have access to that pool of data.
Jeez.
So every
is that ethical?
Is that ethical? Well, I don't know. If you look at it from the perspective of an individual Chinese person, if you believe in, the right to privacy on the internet, you might say that's horrible, that's disgusting, right? But if you look at it from a macro perspective and say, listen, who's going to win this tech race? the Americans or the Chinese? Well, maybe the Chinese, maybe the Americans, but giving the Chinese, the fact that the Chinese government are giving their domestic companies a massive edge over American companies, it's a good strategic move. You know what I mean? Like ignoring the interests of people and ignoring the morality of sharing private data. It's a good move for China.
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of a common trend with not just tech, but a lot of things with China and the United States is that, well, China doesn't have to care about its citizens.
It's not restricted in the same way as America is.
Absolutely. And America is restricted.
That's not to say that America and China don't have, or China doesn't have its own restrictions that isn't burdening China, right? And to speak specifically about the tech industry, one of the main things that is a hindrance to the Chinese tech industry is the lack of innovation, right? And many scholars believe that the root cause of this lack of innovation within China is the oppressive and relatively anti-progressive structure of society and government, right? And to illustrate this, we can look at the number of Nobel laureates produced by the country, right? China has had one Nobel laureate in its history.
Really?
Right? And it was for natural sciences, right? Now, if you look at the Chinese diaspora, Chinese people that live outside of the country, mostly in America, they've won 5 Nobel. There's been 5 Nobel laureates, right? Just out of the Chinese diaspora. And Taiwan, a much smaller country, has had 4.
The real China, right?
No way. A rebellious state that must, submit.
That's crazy.
So China.
So the reason why they have a problem with innovation. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah, and I think that the Chinese model of education and society in general, right, as I've said many times before, is Confucian, right, and that has its benefits and it has its downsides. So from the perspective of innovation and coming up with new ideas, you're not going to get a lot of Steve Jobs coming out of China. You're not going to get a lot of Nikolai Teslas, right, who will just go into their garage and come out with some amazing gadget, right? And there's, just oozing with creativity and creative potential. And, if just given the resources, they will, produce an endless flow of new, awesome stuff. That's not coming out of China a lot. However, although it has in the past, I will say that, right?
Sure.
If you look at the world's inventions, China is responsible for the greatest chunk of them, throughout human history. I mean, paper, gunpowder, canal digging, right? Just a long list of things that Chinese scientists have invented because they've been around for 5,000 years.
Well, they are.
I'm
they
getting
are
I'm
the
getting
oldest
off,
country too.
I'm getting off on a little
Well, I
side
shouldn't say
road
oldest
here.
country.
Yeah.
They're a very old
The
country.
oldest civilization, I would say.
Sure.
Right. So Chinese scientists and Chinese thinkers have trouble with pushing boundaries because the Chinese education system is designed to do the opposite, right? Where Chinese students, instead of being encouraged to think outside of the box and come up with new things and sort of push and question against established knowledge, instead they're encouraged to continue down the path of established knowledge, where what has been learned and said before you is established, right? And it's your job to absorb all of that and then take the next step, right? So you learn and you gobble everything up and then you continue from that point, right? And so that on one hand stifles innovation, right? Because if you're not allowed to push against the existing boundaries of your society, you don't get a lot of, revolutionary art, right? Or you don't get a lot of, insane poetry or plays. You don't get a lot of Shakespeare's, you don't get a lot of Basquiat's. However, what you do get is a lot of technocrats and a lot of engineers that are really good at doing one little specific thing, like engineering, right? Or designing computer chips, right? So that is the upside of that Chinese education system, is that you're able to, equip an army of foot soldiers in this tech war, right? That are able to simply crank out materials and tech, right? And so, no matter how innovative, American companies are, no matter how slick and clean the newest gadget they come out with, the engineers in Shenzhen will be able to replicate it and come out with a version that costs half as much within 6 months, right?
Yeah.
And so that's that competitive edge that China has. They might not be innovators. They might not be producing the slickest, most consumer-friendly goods. However, maybe through sheer weight and through sheer force, right, and through that sheer pool of data, they may have the edge over American companies simply through the weight of the country and the the size of the Chinese domestic market.
Yeah, and that's why they don't need to innovate, is because they're so good at replicating.
Right, and a lot of ways they're just good at running companies. You know what I mean? Like they may not be coming up with the next assembly line like Henry Ford. They may not be coming up with these new online cool things, but they certainly know how to run a company, right?
Yeah.
And if they have enough money behind that company, they can bring it all across the world, right? Look at Huawei. Huawei is installing 5G across the entire world, right? Great Britain had to pass laws banning Huawei from installing 5G all across their country, right? If you look at telecom companies in Africa, it's dominated by Chinese companies because Chinese companies were able to shore up their domestic market and then use that capital to invest in foreign markets in a way that American companies weren't able to do.
Sure.
And they had the backing of the state. So now all of a sudden, if a Chinese company like Huawei approaches the state and says, hey, listen, we want to do a big infrastructure investment project in Kenya, the Chinese government will say, oh, we're trying to be allies with Kenya right now. That's another bargaining chip for us. If their entire cell phone infrastructure is built by a Chinese company that is under our control, sure, here's $1 billion to do that from one of our state-owned banks.
Yeah, and it's in China's interest too, because
exactly.
You know,
so I'm
it's all about geopolitics.
I'm sort of getting off on a little rant here.
Sure.
But what I wanted to basically focus on is, what will a tech race look like in the future with China? Do you think that America's, is Silicon Valley equipped to sort of combat against China's new tech industry?
Yeah, well, I don't know too much about the topic, but I do know that in Silicon Valley, there's so much money. There's so much money, and there's so many people there who are all working very hard on creating the next new tech. And that was really interesting what you brought up about the Nobel Prize and how it's not within the Chinese framework to be innovators, but to be replicators. And
now that's a generalization, obviously.
Sure, I'm sure there's a lot of...
Obviously they do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can see it all throughout history, right? But I'm just saying that is the tendency of the Chinese education system as compared to the American one, right? Just from that perspective. Not trying to make any generalizations,
Sure.
Just trying to compare the context of the Chinese tech industry versus the American tech industry.
And
I apologize for any generalizations. That
well, no, I think it's sometimes you can't go through all the specifics. You gotta.
We can't talk about countries without making only a couple of generalizations.
Absolutely. So yeah, I don't know. Silicon Valley is very close. I don't know. There's a lot of money there, and there's a lot of people working hard to make the next iPhone or to be on the cutting edge of whatever's new and whatever's going to be big. Google, right? There was a whole shebang between Google and China. I don't know if you remember this, about whether or not Google could go to China. But what ended up happening, correct me if I'm wrong, is that China just made a Google that was very, very similar to the Google system. Yeah. And they started using it there. So it doesn't even. I don't think it necessarily matters about whether or not China can innovate new technology, but how fast they can replicate it.
Yeah.
Because
that's the pattern they followed in the past, right? But that's where Xi Jinping is trying to pull us away, right? Or,
Yep.
Not us, obviously.
Sure, but by using the AI and incentivizing people by giving them large sums of money.
Like China has mastered replicating, right? They know how to do that. They know how to make portable batteries, and they know how to make self-driving vacuums, right? I saw that you had a Eufy out there. We have a Eufy at home. They're all made in Shenzhen, and they're good at MIT made the Roomba. They designed it. MIT students they came with the company, made Roomba, and then the Chinese made Eufys, right?
Sure.
Swapped them right out. But like I said, Xi Jinping is trying to move the Chinese economy away from that direction, so that China is actually coming up with the next Roomba, coming up with the next iPhone, coming up with the next whatever the next hot thing is, right?
Sure.
And because China has a significant amount of control over its domestic market, they're able to give their domestic companies an advantage in starting up those new technologies because they're able to give access to 1 billion people that are buying stuff, right? And so they're able to not only pick favorites using state banks, right? Giving certain companies loans and giving them grants for certain research projects, but by also restricting and granting access to the Chinese consumer market in order to benefit certain domestic companies. Yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, well, I mean, if you think about, like you said, about data, the American companies are very limited, right? Because they can't just steal the data from all the American people. Although they do. They do. But again,
but
not on a large scale with the help of the government.
Exactly,
in China.
And it's only Facebook and Google that are able to do it at I mean, obviously Amazon steals a lot of data too, right? But only those three companies are able to do it like at large scales, right? And they only have access to their own data, right? But imagine if you combined all of that, all three of them, with all the other data collected by all the other companies, plus all the NSA data, plus all the FBI data, plus data added on from facial technology and all the tracking devices and all the phones.
Yeah.
And little screen recorders on all the computers.
I mean,
right?
if that's the case, then it's almost certain that China will pass the tech in America, right? Because they have more advantages to produce new stuff.
From an AI perspective, specifically, right? I think that China's downside is when it comes from a consumer perspective, right? American companies are generally better at meeting the needs of consumers and fulfilling those sort of base desires, right? American companies are good at making big trucks, right? And making people want to buy those trucks by showing ads of those trucks driving out in the mountains and stuff, right? Chinese companies are good at making sedans that cost $15,000 and are way cheaper than any other alternative, right? And good at making the next electric car that has the fastest range, right? That's the best way I can illustrate that difference is that whereas Americans are generally more creatively innovative, Chinese people and the Chinese industries that are competing with American ones are generally more technologically innovative and better at just making things that are better based on basic metrics, right? Cheaper, faster, cleaner, cheaper, right?
Yeah,
they're better.
Definitely.
They're good at meeting those basic metrics.
Yeah.
I'm just repeating myself at
No,
this
no,
point.
yeah.
But yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see it play out.
I honestly don't have too much to add about this because I really don't know. You know a lot more about China than I do, but speaking about America, the tech industry is massive. It's huge, and many people rely on those companies, to help them with their basic needs. Like my dad, he's a business owner, and so he has to make sure that he can see all the workings of his company. And so he has a service called, I think, Infusionsoft, that is a tech company that basically tracks all the his sales per product and how much money he's bringing into the company. And it's if he didn't have it, it would be almost impossible for him to continue his business.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of small business owners who really rely on companies like Infusionsoft to provide the data for their company. And if China starts making a product that's better, faster, and cheaper than the Americans do, then sure, they're going to the people in America are going to gravitate towards the better, cheaper, faster.
Yeah.
And it's sure, it's very important that America maintains its tech, because if it maintains its tech, it continues a large amount of its tax revenue in America.
Yeah. And it also, given all these patents to American companies, gives American companies a good edge over, other companies in the world, right? And I sort of have two more brief things to bring up before we move on to the next topic, right? I'm sure it's getting boring at this point.
Sure,
but,
we're kind of repeating ourselves with this topic.
But I think that one point you brought up earlier that's important to mention is that America has a lot more money sitting around, ready to be invested, right? I saw a cool graph comparing the venture capital investments per capita per country, right? Israel was the highest, right, with around $45 per person being invested through venture capital funds, and then America being the next highest with around $25 per. Sorry. Add an extra zero to those. Israel was around $450 per capita, and America was around $230 per capita. China was around $20 per capita. So China does have significantly less money to invest into new technology, into new firms and all that sort of stuff. However, they have tried to sort of reduce that disadvantage that they have by complementing private investment with state investment through the use of state banks and through the use of incentivizing companies to reach these concrete goals.
Maybe that's something that should be implemented in the United States.
Yeah, and I think that's an example of the government working in cooperating with the private market by setting these national goals that the government has decided is best for the country, right?
Yeah.
And incentivizing companies to meet those goals, and to sort of illustrate how that could work in America, we could say that, listen, we want to have electric, we want to have self-driving cars by 2030, right? And the first company to have a working self-driving car gets this massive research grant to implement it, as well as these city grants, right, to implement that program in Los Angeles County and Santa Clara County, right? That could be a way we could incentivize our own private industry to be cutting edge and to maintain our competitive advantage over the industries of other countries, right? While still allowing the market to provide the best solutions for our issues, while still allowing companies to compete with each other and maintain that sort of competitive edge that allows for the development of new products in the first place.
Sure. So I want to bring up a topic. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more interesting. So right now in America, we are continuing to mass produce weapons of destruction. We have been doing it for a very long time. Since the Cold War, we've been stockpiling missiles and stockpiling nuclear weapons. And, throughout the world as well, especially the global superpowers such as, Russia and China, have to meet that force that we're bringing, to the table. They have to meet it to make sure that they are on par with what we have in our military, so that it's in their interest too. So since the Cold War, we've been making these nuclear missiles, and we've been developing the technology that goes into the military, and it's only gone, I think, exponentially up. So our weapons of destruction have gone exponentially up. And recently there's been kind of small skirmishes between India and China over border disputes. And I've seen a few jokes on the internet about World War III and how it's going to come up and all this stuff. Now, if there was a World War III, it would be the most devastating war ever, just because of the amount of military weapons and nukes and technology that we have now. How today do we maintain peace? Because we've been in this period of peace ever since the Cold War ended, and there's not been many wars going on in the world. Of course, Afghanistan and in the Middle East somewhat, but they're all proxy wars. Now, if there was a large scale war between, let's say, the United States and China, it would be so devastating. And we're seeing tensions rise between India and China right now. And how do we maintain this peace throughout the world? Because we're sitting on nukes. We could destroy entire countries with the amount of bombs and missiles we have.
We could kill everybody in the world. I mean,
seriously,
with the size of the bombs that we have. I mean, I think that to sort of touch on the China India issue really quickly before we get into peace as a whole, right? I think that China and India have actually worked out a pretty good system for letting off steam, where all of the guards up in those valleys are unarmed, right? So it's basically just dudes fist fighting each other up in the
I've seen the
mountains.
videos.
It's
hilarious.
It's when you hear that headline of Indian and Chinese troops clash in the Himalayas, potential border dispute, flares up, right? It seems threatening. You know what I mean? Like, you're imagining people shooting at each other from little hideouts and bunkers going off and bombs being dropped and stuff. Like, that's what you imagine when you hear a skirmish, but it's really nothing more than guys yelling at each other and fighting up in the mountains,
pushing each other,
and they're all wearing big gloves too.
Yeah,
so it's
they don't hurt.
no one's really getting hurt that bad. Although people died, four Indian soldiers died this last weekend. So I
sure
don't want to negate their deaths, and all peace and love to their families. But I think that overall, it's a relatively good way of letting off that sort of rivalrous steam that generates between these two massive superpowers. And I think that ultimately neither of them wants to fight a war with each other. And unless one of them wants to fight that war, then we're not going to see that war. And the main reason is the Himalayas themselves. They form the most effective deterrent for war in the world, right?
Yeah.
China doesn't want to fight a war through the Himalayas, and India certainly doesn't want to fight a war through the Himalayas. And China is preparing has been preparing for several years now to bolster that deterrent by building infrastructure up into the Himalayas. They've built the world's highest elevation railway into Tibet. They built big roads and dams and lots of infrastructure projects to sort of bolster their ability to wage a war in the Himalayas. However, China is still not equipped to, launch an attacking force that would be able to topple India through the Himalayas as of now. They would certainly be able to defend. They would not be able to attack. So China, it's not beneficial for China to do it, right?
It's not beneficial for India.
And India definitely doesn't want to attack into the Himalayas.
Yeah, or attack China.
Yeah, exactly. Just China in general, right? So I think that the potential of a Chinese-Indian conflict, as of right now, based on the current situation, is not something I'm super afraid of. However, I think that the geopolitical alignment within Asia right now is sort of building up to be a powder keg for a potential war between China and America, right? And that's because China has allied itself with it's allied itself with the enemies of America's allies, if that makes sense, right? So
yes.
India doesn't like Pakistan, and China is allied with Pakistan,
yeah.
and America likes South Korea, and South Korea doesn't like North Korea, and China is North Korea's biggest supporter, right? So that pattern gets repeated throughout Eastern Asia, right? Where these countries that are generally against America or geopolitically against its allies come into China's orbit, and as that web of alliances builds slowly, the potential for conflict between China and America only increases.
That's right.
However, I do think that China's leadership is calculated, and they are strategic, and they're not rash, right? I don't think that you're going to see the Chinese making any rash decisions that are going to cause war unless the Chinese government is fully prepared for war and fully willing to go to war.
Definitely.
So, and I don't think that that's going to be for a long time. Until America has weakened significantly and the Chinese military thinkers genuinely believe they can beat America in a war, it's not going to happen, right? Because America doesn't want to go to war with China. China doesn't want to go to war with America.
That's right.
However, now is where we got to bring up the Thucydides trap, and this is something that I've brought up in the past, but I think that it's important to bring up again when looking at the potential for conflict between China and America. And the Thucydides trap is the idea that when there is an established power and a rising power, it is in the best interest for both of them to act like they're willing to go to war. So it is in the best interest of America to act like they're willing to go to war. That's why we send our aircraft carriers to the South China Sea, and we, get real close in the Taiwanese Strait between China and America to sort of front like we're willing to go to war, because that way we're able to get concessions that are in America's best interest. However, we're not actually willing to go to war. The same pattern is repeated with China, where China acts like it's willing to go to war. That's why it puts its troops, in the Himalayas, and that's why it, postures the way it does in the South China Sea, and it builds those islands, and it, does all of these things. It, builds a military base in Djibouti and Gwadar. In order to get concessions from America and other countries that it can get concessions from. So it's in their best interest to act in that way. However, all of those actions bring the two countries closer to the spark that may lead to actual war.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that neither country actually wants to go to war, it is in their best interest to inch slowly towards the reality of actual war.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the trap that we saw that caused a spark of World War I, right? Where Germany didn't actually want to fight Russia, and Germany didn't actually want to fight France and Great Britain. However, it was in their best interest to act like they were willing to, right? In order to get more African colonies and expand in the Pacific and do all of these things that were in the interest of the German nation.
Yep.
And so the spark that led to World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and because it was in the best interest for all of those countries to be allied with one another, it led to that sort of spiraling effect that caused Europe to break out into war. So we could potentially see the same sort of thing in between China and America, and as the conflicts of interest between China and America increase, the potential for a spark only increases, right?
That's right.
So now that China and America are indirectly involved in the Korean conflict and the Indo-Pakistani conflict, that creates hotbeds that could lead to a potential conflict between those two.
And you also have to consider the industrial military complex.
Mm-hmm.
We're building all these weapons for a reason, because we want money. That's really why we're building these weapons, is we want to. We see it as an investment. I've brought this up a few times on previous podcasts, is that the reason why we build weapons in the military is because we see it as an investment. we're going to spend 700 million, 700 billion, $700 billion worth of aircrafts and carriers in order to, extract resources from other countries, potentially. And, when we do this, what we're promoting is war. By giving $700 billion to the military, what you're doing is you're promoting war. That's the only reason why you build, aircraft carriers and tanks and all this is to prepare for a potential war.
Yeah.
And so, if we could instead take that $700 billion and try and put it somewhere else that's, more useful in maybe housing complexes or healthcare or whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe it would
or even if we keep our focus on the conflict with China, we can spend that money more effectively in the way that we were talking about earlier. We can use that money to incentivize American domestic industry to remain competitive against Chinese domestic industry, right? So that we can take that money and use it to fund, AI investments or self-driving car technology or electric car technology or any of the other fields that America or that China is currently outspending us on.
Yeah. And I might sound, too optimistic when I say this, but why do we need all these weapons? Right? Why there should be no purpose for them.
Yeah.
No, country should. I know this is going to sound real hippie, we should make.
Well, I'm glad we can have a little role reversal here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'll give the right wing defense point why we need nukes, right? And you can give me your hippie dippy Greenpeace argument.
Look, at heart, I'm a Catholic, right? And I don't want people to die for And here's another point: who goes to war and who dies in war? Right. The poor, right? The people, the working class. Well, not necessarily poor. The working class, not the rich. Yeah. Right, and so the wars are fought by the working class and never by the rich,
for the benefit of the rich.
Exactly, and you have to think about how many Lockheed Martins and Boeings are benefiting by war.
Yeah, exactly, and how many families get a folded flag sent home, right?
Exactly.
For what? For the potential for free college? That's bullshit.
But again, why can't we just stop making nukes?
Yeah. Well, let me give the counter argument.
Yeah,
right?
Go ahead. Little role reversal.
That nukes actually save lives.
Really?
That by having the incredible deterrent of the potential destruction of all of humanity, it creates an incredible obstacle that prevents great powers from going to war with each other. I mean, I think that taking a step back from the Chinese-American conflict and instead looking at a historical conflict that has mostly resolved itself at this point, the American and Soviet arms race led to an incredible deterrent for conflict, right? That's why that's why it was the Cold War, right? Is that both the Soviets and the Americans knew that if they got into direct conflict with each other, there was the potential for the annihilation of their country. So they were incentivized to wage proxy wars, right? Which were costly and destroyed countries and were led to the loss of lives of many, many people. However, it averted the potential loss of life of everybody in the Soviet Union and everybody in America, right? Or every major city, at least.
Sure.
So by upholding a nuclear arsenal, we deter ourselves and we deter our enemies from engaging in all-out war with each other. So do I condemn proxy conflicts? Absolutely. Do I condemn American imperialism? Absolutely. It has led to the slaughter of millions of innocent people and is just as brutal as any of the past colonial empires, like the British, like the French, like the Russians. Were just as brutal and it is just as horrible. However, that reality of American imperialism is not as horrible as the potential reality of all-out nuclear holocaust as a result of a hot, real war between two major powers, right?
Yeah.
And it's happened all over the world, right? The nuclear deterrent, right? We haven't seen India and Pakistan really go to war with each other. They've had skirmishes and they've killed people on each other's sides, but they've never gone to full all-out war with each other since they've developed their nuclear weapons because they know that there's the potential threat of complete annihilation.
Yeah.
And that threat is a big deterrent for lawmakers or policymakers that have the ability to go to war.
Yeah, well, there was a case in during the Cold War where I think it was JFK, but he detonated 95 nuclear bombs, right? And just testing 95 nuclear bombs. And it's not like when you get to the 91st nuke, it's not like, oh, well, I don't know if the next one's going to blow up. You know, it's
well, we need a little bit more data.
Yeah,
so let's
exactly.
go 4 more, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. When you get to the 91st nuke, you
Yeah.
know they work.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
You know, the reason why you keep blowing up the last 4 to reach 95 is so that you can show your force to the other countries.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, I mean, yeah, Russia knew that the United States was blowing up their nukes and testing them. The reason why they did it is so that they could show force and say, hey, if we go to war, I'll blow you up. Right? And so,
Yeah, so let's take that nuclear perspective of deterrence.
I thought that was kind of funny.
yeah. Me too.
Nuclear perspective.
Yeah, nuclear perspective. I mean, we can see how it's been applied from the American perspective, because it's been, shoved down our throats by the American government and the American media, right? That we're the saviors of the world and we need these nukes, right? Or otherwise the world will collapse into chaos and anarchy, right?
Sure.
However, let's take a look at it from the perspective of other countries and other leaders, right? Let's say we're Muammar Gaddafi, or we're, the premier of Iran, or we're, a member of the Kim regime, right? Wouldn't the same scenario be applied, however, even more drastically in a defense from a defense perspective? So let's say we're Kim Jong-un, right? And we inherit this country, right, from our father, and now all of a sudden we're cast into ruling it, right? Now all of a sudden that's just what we have to do. And we look across the world and we see in Libya that Muammar Gaddafi decided to make a deal with America, right, to promise not to develop nuclear weapons. And Muammar Gaddafi abided by those rules, right? He continued to pump oil out of his country, continued to rule the country as a dictator, right? However, the CIA ended up assassinating him, right? And threw Libya into the civil war and into the chaos that we see now. So, as a Kim family member, how does that potential look, right? If I make a deal with America, the CIA is still going to come in and kill me because they know that I'm still ultimately against America despite me making 1 or 2 deals with them. Or I can choose to say, screw you to America and continue to develop my nuclear weapons. And now at that point, I have a big deterrent against American invasion.
Yeah.
Because if you look at Libya, the reason that, or maybe one of the potential reasons the CIA felt that they could engage in that sort of assassination is that there was no potential threat to American lives. They knew that there were not going to be missiles dropped in New York City or Washington, D.C. as a result of that assassination. However, now all Americans have seen the stories. We know that North Korean missiles can hit L.A. and they can hit San Francisco, they can hit Seattle, and now that we all know that, we don't want that to happen, right? Obviously,
yeah,
right?
Obviously, yeah.
And so our care for our own lives and our desire not to see our cities nuked outweigh the desire to see the North Korean regime toppled, right? Before in Libya, there was not that potential, right? And so the CIA felt that it was more beneficial for America to simply kill Muammar Gaddafi and deal with the consequences, because they wouldn't be upsetting a good chunk of Americans. Now, if they tried to do the same thing with Kim Jong-un and potentially get millions of Americans killed in a nuclear blast, they're much less likely to engage in the sort of conduct they did in Libya. So it is beneficial for North Korea not only to maintain their nuclear weapons, but launch them into the Sea of Japan and threaten South Korea with them and show just how powerful our ICBMs are. We can hit Los Angeles, we can hit Seattle, right? So the same sort of pattern and the same sort of structure is replicated for smaller countries that are not necessarily great powers, right? That it is in their best interest to spend a massive amount of resources that could otherwise be spent, like you said, educating the people, on housing, on food, and instead spend those on their nuclear arsenal, right? So let's take a step back now and not look at a country that has nukes or hasn't had nukes, but a country that might or might not have nukes, Iran. Right? Now, they don't have nukes right now, as far as I know, and as far as most international observers know. They don't have nukes. However, they have the potential to develop nukes relatively quickly. They have the resources, they have the infrastructure in place, and they have the ability to refine uranium to make those nuclear weapons. Now, if you were the Ayatollah, what would you do? Would you choose to take the route of Kim Jong-un and develop your own nuclear arsenal in order to deter Americans and Israelis and the Saudi Arabians from invading or attacking your country? Or would you choose to take the route of Muammar Gaddafi and try to cut a deal and try to nestle up with the American monster.
Sure.
And,
You look at the history of it and you say which one worked and which one did not work.
Yeah.
Right. Muammar Gaddafi did not work.
Right. He's dead and
he's
Kim
dead.
Jong-un's not. Yeah.
Exactly. So I would look at the history of it. Well, I can't trust the United States because look what they did. And I would take the route of Kim Jong-un and say I'll develop my own nuclear weapons. And really what you're talking about is you're saying, well, you could choose to be self-sufficient and develop your own nuclear weapons, or you can choose to be dependent on the American government.
Yeah. And the issue with that is that, obviously there are downsides with developing nuclear weapons. The North Korean economy is in shambles because
it's
almost
expensive.
every single major country in the world has sanctioned them, and every time they launch another missile, they get new sanctions, right? so I don't know, like what I'm trying to sum up here and try to draw it back and make a big old thesis about American imperialism is that by constantly invading countries and toppling countries and destroying regimes that we deem illegitimate or cruel or corrupt, we are incentivizing countries to invest in nuclear arsenals, the act of which hurts the people of that country. So we may think that by going out and assassinating Muammar Gaddafi, we're helping the people of Libya, but not only are we hurting the people of Libya, as evidenced by the state of Libya right now, right, a four-way civil war where there's constant chaos and no income into the country, we not only hurt the people of Libya, but we also hurt all of the rest of the people that are ruled by potentially dangerous dictators that are threatened by American imperialism. Now all of a sudden we're pushing all of those dictators and we're incentivizing them to spend money on nuclear weapons instead of spending that money on their people or spending it on education programs or spending it on infrastructure investments. So not only are we hurting the people that we invade and the countries that we topple, but we're also incentivizing other countries to take money away from their people and spend it on weapons of mass destruction. And I think that's a bad downside that a lot of Americans don't really look at when considering American foreign policy decisions.
Yeah.
And especially not the American government, right?
Absolutely.
We keep on wondering why there's all these anti-American regimes that pop up all over the place. Like, well, maybe it's because we topple every single regime that we deem anti-American, right?
Yeah. We just kill the person.
Yeah, like obviously, there's not a lot of dictatorships that burn the flag of Belgium. Right? And I wonder why. Well, because Belgium didn't topple their neighbors, and there's not Belgian troops stationed in almost every continent in the world, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, no one's gonna hate the Belgians.
And you worry about exactly.
Well, the people of the Congo do hate the Belgians,
Sure. Well,
deservingly, right?
Yes.
When the Belgians cut off enough hands, right? You're bound to hate them, right?
Yeah. Or
ignoring that, right?
Sure.
I just think that generally, Americans like to believe that we're the world police, right? And that when we come somewhere, we make it good, right? And that we're the good guys, right? And everything we do, we're toppling bad guys.
Hey, it's taught in school,
right? Yeah, that's what we all learn. And if you don't take enough time to independently, look at that yourself, most Americans are under the impression that everything we do is good, right? But from the perspective of other leaders and from the perspective of developing or not developing a nuclear arsenal, we hurt the world immensely. Not just the countries we invade, but the countries that decide to spend money on their military as opposed to their people as a result of our decisions.
Yeah, well, and you can definitely you can make a very good point that the United States has hurt the global economy in more ways than it's helped it.
Yeah, it was just people, not just the economy, but just humanity.
Jeez,
humanity in general.
Something to think about. And I don't know. Well, hey, we've done some good things too.
Yeah, we won World War II.
Sure, we turned the tides in World War One.
Right. Although I don't know if the good guys won that one. That was a much more gray area war in my opinion, where everybody was basically the same. You know what I mean?
Sure. And then after the fact,
are German imperialists going to win or British imperialists? Right? And is either of them a good guy? No. I mean,
not really.
They're all cutting off hands and they're all stealing resources.
Yeah, and America.
And America did the same thing. We
Sure.
weren't the good guys after the war. We went, swooped in, and we took just as many colonies as Britain and France, right?
And we laid the foundation for a dictator to come in too.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't know. You have anything else you want to say in terms of American foreign policy? We had a nice little talk there about China, America, nukes.
Nukes, yeah. That's really what I'm concerned about is nukes.
So let me get your summarized overall take, right?
Sure.
Do you think that nukes right now, or nukes in America's hands, the way they are being held right now, are they overall good or bad? in the world, right? Like
Well,
if
I
you,
wouldn't
if you sum it up,
Sure,
right?
I wouldn't necessarily.
Would it be better
say
if we
they're-
just maintained them, or if we could magically zap
Sure.
them all away with a genie? Would we
Sure.
do that, or maybe even all the nukes in the world? Would we zap all those away?
Well, look. To your first point, whether or not nukes are good or bad, that's not the question. They're necessary.
Yeah.
Right.
So in that way, are they good?
Well, they're
If the alternative without nukes is worse than the alternative with nukes, I would say that they're better than worse.
Yeah, well, okay, so here's the thing. If America just got rid of all its nukes right
Mm-hmm.
now, that would be so weakening to the military in America. Like that's one of the reasons why we don't have China, invading.
But
the
would
United
that
States.
benefit the world?
I don't know. I really don't know.
From a utilitarian perspective, overall good versus overall bad as a result of that. I don't know.
When you build a nuke,
we're just doing thought experiments
Sure,
here.
this is just a hypothetical. I don't know the answer either. I mean,
right?
I'm thinking about it.
Here's two different scenarios,
Sure.
right? All American nukes go away, right? Russia still has their nukes, Israel still has their nukes, Pakistan still has their nukes. Or the alternative, all nukes disappear. No one has nukes.
Look, if all nukes disappeared, then everyone would start making nukes right
away. You
right
think
away.
so?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's just wipe nukes out of existence, and
The technology.
Nagasaki, Hiroshima never happened.
Sure.
We just never decided to go down that route, and no one is going to. Right? How about that alternative?
I would like that.
Do you think
Yeah,
that
I think that'd be
alternative
good.
world would be better?
Look, I take my position from a Catholic point of view,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
I don't want to see people die.
Yeah, I don't know. Like to me, I still fall back on sort of the deterrent perspective. That I think that if we didn't have nukes in the post World War II era, the Cold War would have been a hot war, and something would have sparked off. And without that massive deterrent, the chances of a real conflict between the Soviet Union and the American bloc
Was
of the world
very real.
would have been much more real and much more possible. I mean, if you just think about all those, like I said, little potential spark points where the Thucydides trap was in play. The chances for a real nuclear war would have been, or real hot war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union would have been much higher.
Yeah.
And so I think that
the Cold War was all about brinkmanship, right? How close can we get to the edge and not pull the trigger?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And that's the reason why they could have brinkmanship is
Right.
because there were nuclear weapons
Exactly.
that were the threat.
Exactly. If there was no big giant cliff facing them and it was just a giant gentle slope that would bring them down into the valley of destruction, I think that they would have found a much easier time going down that hill, right?
Instigating the war.
Because from there, without nuclear weapons, the transition from a proxy war to a real war is much less grand.
Sure.
Right?
Not as devastating.
That transferring from, let's take the Korean War, for example. Americans were fighting Soviets, right? In the air, right? Soviet fighter jets were the ones that were bombing American troops, and American fighter jets were the ones fighting those Soviet jets in the air, right? However, the Soviet Union had no official involvement in the Korean War. They were only,
They were giving resources.
Exactly. Just material, no boots on the ground, no Soviet troops were involved officially, right? And officially, it was not an American war against Korea. It was a UN intervention, right? A police action, right? But without the deterrent of nuclear weapons, maybe the Soviets would have been officially involved in the war. And maybe the Americans would have officially been at war with the Soviets, right? And that might have led to, a Soviet invasion of, West Germany or an American invasion of East Germany, vice versa. I don't know. So I think that obviously we don't know the past and we don't know what maybe the world would have been a lot better without nuclear weapons at all. However, I think that just the terribleness of a hot war between the America and the Soviet Union is so terrible and so much worse than the two nuclear strikes that have happened in the world so far. That the potential lives lost of a hot war greatly outweighs the potential.
Yeah. So
the actual lives lost during nuclear strikes in our past. Because that's the important thing to consider is that it's not like nukes have been going off every 20 years, right? It's not like the Israelis dropped nukes on Cairo, even though they had access to those nukes when they were at war with Egypt. So I think that the real threat of nukes have largely been avoided while still allowing for the good potential benefits of nukes.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. The good of having nukes is that it deters, massive wars because it would be extremely devastating if a total war was, if China and America went to war.
Yeah. Now, although we probably want to get off the subject of nukes, I want to pose one last little question. Right?
Sure.
Nukes act as an incredibly, unequal balancing force, right? That when one side has nukes and the other doesn't, that side automatically has a much larger bargaining chip. Not just talking about conventional war, right? If two countries are going to war and one country has nukes yet they're not using them, then those nukes are irrelevant in the war, right? It's about who has the best tanks, who has the best foot soldiers, who has the best strategy, right? Who can win the air war. But in negotiations, before we get to real war, having nukes acts as an incredibly powerful bargaining chip, right? So if in a diplomatic talk, right, between China and Laos, China has way more bargaining chips, not just economically and demographically, but because they have nukes and they have the ability to nuke Laos, they are able to get much greater concessions. So from that perspective, nukes have allowed several countries to extract a lot of concessions, while at the cost of the interests of all of those smaller countries without nukes. So in that way, they've been an unequalizer in the world stage, and they've allowed certain countries to benefit at the cost of other countries, and further promoting sort of the unequal world that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because I mean, I wouldn't want to be Laos,
Conversation with China, yeah.
Exactly. You have to take concessions from China because, if you don't, they could just bomb you and your country could just disappear off the map.
Yeah.
I don't know. What was the question again? I forget.
I don't remember. We're talking about is it better or not, right?
Is it better or not? Again, it's not. I don't think it's about whether or not it's good or bad. I think it's more than
it's an impossible question to answer, right?
Exactly,
because we don't know the answer, right?
Exactly, it's an impossible question to answer because it's a hypothetical. We're just using we're just abstracting.
I'm just thinking about it. Yeah,
I don't know. My whole take on the whole nukes throughout the world. A lot of countries have nukes and they could use them at any point and devastate whole cities and level whole
countries.
Yeah. Seriously.
You get Luxembourg with one nuke.
Exactly. Yeah. Luxembourg. Yeah. Amsterdam.
Liechtenstein.
With two.
Off the map. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I don't know. I take kind of a hippie perspective, which is if we just didn't have nukes, the world would be such a great place, or at least a much better place than it is now. I don't want to see anyone die. Right. One nuke could kill. If you dropped a nuke in Tokyo, for instance, how many millions of civilians could you kill in an instant? I just don't think people should have that power. The power to devastate whole cities and you kill thousands, hundreds, millions of lives. I just don't think people should have that power.
It's important to recognize that it's not people that have that power; it's countries, right? That it's not the whim of one person. Although one could argue that an American president or a Chinese premier has that power. But I would say that there's a large web of people that share that power, right? And obviously, you and I have much less power.
So let me give you a story
than a general.
Sure.
Right?
Let me give you a story.
It's not one person; it's a group of people that share that responsibility.
So there was the Warcom meetings during the Cold War with JFK and these 12 other generals and his younger brother.
Let me get some water.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll tell the story. And Robert Kennedy. They were all at these meetings.
Some more of this?
Yeah, they're in the fridge. And this took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you can think of the Cuban Missile Crisis as a timer that was set, right? Right when we knew that there were missiles in Cuba put up. It's under the fridge, so go down. Yeah. Cool. So this took place. JFK. He got photos. He got photos that showed that there were missiles on Cuba. He had a meeting with I think it was Khrushchev at the time. Yeah, he had a meeting with Khrushchev, and said, hey, are you putting missiles in Cuba? If you're doing that, that's bad, and you can't do that, right? And Khrushchev said, no, we're not putting missiles there, but in fact they were. And Khrushchev made a decision that he thought JFK was weak, and he based his whole Cuban Missile Crisis, putting the missiles on Cuba based on the fact that JFK was weak and that he could have fully operational missiles pointed towards, big cities in the United States, Washington D.C., possibly New York, definitely Florida, Atlanta. Yep. He was betting on the fact that he could have operational missiles before JFK could notice. Mm-hmm. And so there were 4 decisions that once JFK found out that they were putting missiles on Cuba, there were 4 decisions that he and his generals were discussing. And it's really interesting, too. They have the recorded tapes of their meetings. So the first one was set up a blockade around the island to make sure that no more missiles could come in. And that's what we did. The second one was we could have a full-scale invasion of Cuba with boots on the ground, go throughout Cuba and take down their missiles. Third option was target their missiles with our missiles and blow up their missiles and get rid of their threat altogether. And the fourth was bomb the civilians and just bomb the shit out of Cuba. That was the fourth option. This is really interesting. So the generals in Cuba, not generals in Cuba, the generals in the United States wanted to bomb Cuba. They wanted to drop their nukes in Cuba and kill, everyone in Cuba. That was what they wanted. And they were all trying to convince JFK to do that. That would mean a total war with Russia, or with USSR at the time, right? Yeah, USSR. With the USSR. JFK was the only person at the meeting who said, we're not doing that. What we're going to do instead is we're just going to set up a blockade. And it was a very gutsy move by himself. I don't know where I'm going with this whole story. I guess I was going to talk about brinkmanship and nukes, but yeah, that's what happened. And yeah, the threat of a total war was avoided by just setting up these blockades.
Well, he also did the Bay of Pigs, right? And that
was a failure.
And that was another scenario in which JFK was unwilling to utilize the full potential of the American military, where he refused to send American fighter jets to bomb the Cuban defenses once the Cuban diaspora, the CIA trained soldiers had made a beachhead, and so they were massacred, right?
Yep.
But I wanna I don't know, talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis more broadly, right? Where, I don't know, from like a bystander's perspective, right? Obviously, I am an American, and I learned about the Cold War from an American perspective. But if you look at it just like straight up, like facts, right? Where nukes are, right? Which country has nukes closer to the other's capital? Like, we had nukes in Turkey and in West Germany and in Finland and in all these NATO countries, in Italy, right? We were able to strike all of the Russian heartland, right, with our nukes in an instant, right? Yet the Russians were at that disadvantage where they had no stronghold within the North or South America, and the Cuban Revolution was kind of a godsend for the Soviets, where they were able to not, like, the Soviets had zero to little involvement at all in the Cuban Civil War. It was really just a genuine popular uprising that was able to take control over the country and oust the American puppet dictator at that point, Batista. And I think that there was a sort of a crux in the road where Cuba could have been an American ally and remained within America's sphere of influence, however, being a left-wing country. However, because of America's political situation during the Cold War, there was no tolerance for that, right? And so because the Americans rejected the Cubans and, sanctioned them immediately, right, announced a blockade immediately as soon as the revolutionaries won the Civil War, cut them off completely, removed all American investments, stripped the country of all their money, cut off all American imports or exports to the country. They did their best to try to drown Cuba as soon as this new Cuba was born. However, I think that if the American government had instead taken a different route and simply approached Cuba, and they really could have, avoided the entire Cuban Missile Crisis and not allowed the Soviet Union to get a foothold within the Americas, the way they did. So I think that it was American stubbornness almost and unwillingness to compromise or to think strategically that ultimately led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, obviously, from the perspective of the Soviet Union, it makes total sense to try to have missiles in Cuba because the Americans have missiles 2,000 miles from Moscow in Turkey, yet our missiles are 12,000 miles from Washington, D.C., all the way across the Atlantic. And in order to level that playing field and to allow ourselves...
We need Cuba.
We need Cuba, and we need missiles there so that we can bargain on an equal playing field with the Americans. And also from a Cuban perspective, obviously, you're going to approach the Soviet Union as the world's other sole superpower once the Americans have rejected you economically. So, I mean, it makes total sense why Cuba and why the Soviet Union made the decisions that they made. To me, the only real place to lay blame and to lay fault is with the American, military and its unwillingness to think strategically, and instead was blinded by sort of this anti-communist fervor that actually hindered America's capability to remain the global hegemon. Now, was that warranted? In some ways, yes. Obviously, looking at the global situation, we could see why American generals were obsessed with anti-communism and why they were unwilling to negotiate or compromise with Castro's Cuba. I don't know though.
It's a very confusing topic, and there's so much into it. I actually never had considered that perspective about whether or not why couldn't America just have taken in Cuba instead of, because of course anti-communist fervor was all throughout America. You had the McCarthy list at the times. Communism was the taboo word, and anyone who was called a communist was silenced instantly.
But like looking at it outside of an ideological perspective, right? And just looking at it from, is this a regime that is morally okay to support? I think that instead of judging the Castro regime based on American standards, or even the way some people do, universal ideal standards, right? And that, any government that kills anybody within their country is evil, right? And that's the way many intellectuals judged Cuba, right? Is that, listen, they executed war prisoners. That's horrible, and therefore we should not have contact with them. However, I think that we should judge Cuba's potential for American interaction by the metric of what our other allies look like. Listen, if we support economically, diplomatically, and politically, and militarily, the government of Guatemala, the dictatorship there that murders, thousands and thousands of indigenous people every single year, then why can't we support Cuba, which, kills a significantly lower amount of people that are political prisoners, right? Obviously, killing political prisoners is not good, and I do not condone that. However,
here's the thing, though. America does it all the time.
Yeah, we do it all the time, too. That's the thing. It's like we don't live up to our own standard that we use to criticize potential enemies, right?
Think about Guantanamo Bay.
It's in Cuba.
It's in Cuba.
It's in Cuba, and we extrajudicially murder and torture and maim
and
innocent Muslims.
Guantanamo Bay isn't just unique. We have
black sites all over the world.
Over the world. Yeah, and I saw a very interesting graph where basically it took the world and it showed how we take prisoners who we believe are, from the whatever Islamic regime that we're fighting at the time, and we take those prisoners and we torture them at one site, and if they don't give us the answers that we want there, we take them and we move them to a different site, from like Warsaw to Northern Africa, and then from Northern Africa to Bangkok. Yeah, exactly. And to say that America doesn't use extrajudicial, have an extrajudicial system where we just take prisoners and torture them to death is completely wrong. And
not just prisoners, and not just American enemies, but innocent people, right? Like just a Muslim guy that lived in Kentucky, right?
Yeah, that we thought.
Sorry, we messed up. We just tortured him for 6 years. Just horrible things, right?
Super horrible things.
I don't really know where we're going.
I don't know either. It's just remarkable that we still do it.
Oh, it's disgusting, right? And Obama didn't shut it down. That was something he said on the campaign trail, that he was gonna end Guantanamo Bay. Right? It's still there. They're still doing the same stuff. There's still innocent Muslims that are locked up.
Well, they're independent. It's part of the CIA, right? The central.
Yeah, it's not owned by the American government.
No.
It's owned by a long chain of shady contractors that slowly loop back to the CIA. Once you dig deep enough, right?
Sure.
And I don't know. I think that the American perspective on Cuba is incredibly outdated, and that Cuba has in the face of economic, almost certain economic death and apocalypse, has succeeded, right? And that despite sanctions and embargo from the biggest economic power in the world, they've still been able to reach incredible heights, right?
Cuba?
Yeah, I mean,
I thought Cuba was still kind of. I thought Cuba still had its problems, like taxi drivers making more than doctors in Cuba.
I mean, they have their problems, right? As do we, and as does every other country in the world, right? However, I think that looking at like basic metrics of like infant mortality, right? How many children die when they're being born? They do better than we do.
Really?
They have a better healthcare system than we do, right? In terms of the number of people that are homeless, They do way better than we do. There are no homeless people in Cuba, right? Now, do people have
There's not
beautiful...
no homeless people in
there,
Cuba.
there are. Like, because there's a government program that says if you are homeless, we are legally obliged to provide you a home, right?
Cuba's a small country.
And programs like that can be scaled up. All I'm saying is that for being completely cut off from the American economy, which is the biggest import-export partner with every single country in the Caribbean, right? If you compare, right, Haiti's economic reliance to America, and you compare that to Cuba's, it's remarkable what Cuba has done. And I'm not able to pull, specific metrics that show that Cuba has been relatively successful out of my ass. Like, I'm not able to do that right now. I'll bring him to the next podcast, right?
No, I believe you,
of
course.
I think that if you compare Cuba's situation, right, the context in which Cuba started off at,
They should have died.
They should have died, right? And the regime should have collapsed, and they should have, crumbled into instability and chaos. However, not only have they maintained the regime, they have instilled democracy at a nationwide level. They have done all of these incredible achievements, all while being under the foot of American imperialism and constantly trying to constantly facing CIA ploys and hacks and assassination attempts.
Sure.
Right.
Well,
it's
in Cuba,
incredible. It's incredible. I mean,
absolutely,
it's
incredible.
I think it's remarkable. I don't know.
That's really cool.
And have they done bad things? Absolutely.
Oh,
have
yeah.
they killed people? Yes.
Yes.
Did the Castro brothers and Che Guevara have some problematic views on gay people and people of other races? Yes. However, judging from a macro perspective, I'm impressed, and if you look into it, I think you'll be impressed too.
That's interesting. Cuba and America before the Cuban Missile Crisis and before the Cuban Revolution had good relations. Relatively.
Well, it's because they were our puppet state, right?
Yeah, and people like to visit Cuba, because it's a pretty place.
Well, we took over Cuba from the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, where we
That's
got
right,
Puerto
yeah.
Rico, right? And so we just installed our guy Batista, and he just let Americans run wild, right? And he just let brothels and casinos and pleasure houses take control over all of Havana, and they let American companies and American plantations walk all over the people of Cuba, and that was what led to those conditions that led to the revolution in the first place.
Sure.
Right? It's like, we loved Batista, and Batista loved us because we all made tons of money, but it was at the cost of the Cuban people, and that's why there was such wide support for these revolutionaries when they went and fled into the mountains of Cuba, right? I mean, if you compare it to many other potential revolutions that had that same starting point of a group of revolutionaries of 40 to 200 people going up into the mountains, Cuba was able to do incredible things because of that context.
Yeah, so we created the problem.
We created. We call a problem we created. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't know. I thought it was interesting.
No, that is interesting.
It was interesting.
That is interesting. I've always known that it was kind of the place where people go during the wintertime, right? You go to Cuba, you smoke some cigars.
It's beautiful. Yeah, my mom went there for like a couple weeks.
Really?
A couple months ago. Yeah.
We still, to this day, have certain sanctions on Cuba.
Hey, it's a full embargo. No trade, no imports, no exports.
Really?
That's why Cuban cigars are illegal. But my mom was able to go there because a friend of hers was going there for a research program through his university that he worked for, and so there was a special little diplomatic pass, and so he was given three visas for his friends. So
did she like it there?
Oh, it was awesome. Yeah, she brought back propaganda posters for me, so I got a couple Che Guevaras in my room looking down on me. Yeah, she had an awesome time, and I think that our Cold War position on Cuba is not only incredibly outdated, but is harmful for the Cuban people especially, but the American people as well.
They're so close to Florida. They're like 60 miles off the coast.
Like it would be better for Americans and for Cubans if we ended the obsolete Cold War embargo that Trump reinstated.
Yeah, there's a lot of.
I can emphasize.
Trump reinstated
Obama ended it and began the process of renewing diplomatic relations with Cuba, and then immediately as soon as Trump came into office, he reversed all of that progress and went back to the Cold War state of things. What do you think of that? Do you think that was a good move?
I don't know. This is the first time I'm hearing of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of an interesting perspective that we created the problem in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and our imperialism to try and take over as many islands as we can, right?
Yeah. Make as much money for ourselves. As we
Exactly.
can.
Yeah. What do we take? We took over Puerto Rico too, right?
Yeah,
Puerto
still
Rico.
America, yeah.
Took over the Philippines. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what to think about all of it.
Yeah. All right. Well,
You want to get another topic going?
Yeah. Let's transition on to the next one. Right. So right now we are surrounded by goods, right?
Yeah.
And looking around us, right? There's a water filter.
Yeah.
There are microphones, computers, a big flat screen TV, wrenches and fishing poles and cardboard boxes. And I don't know about you, but I would say I have zero idea how to make or produce any of these things, and I have no idea what goes into them. I mean, I have some idea, probably plastic and metal and stuff.
Oh, sure, and
but,
also
but,
oil.
But yeah, but like I really have zero knowledge on how to bring these things to myself, right? If you ask me, hey, go make yourself a cardboard box, I would have no idea where to start and what to do, right?
Yeah.
And that's the world that we live in. Is that we have very little knowledge in the scale of things, right? We're surrounded by a world built by the knowledge of other people, right? And it is through that exchange of knowledge and through the specialization of knowledge that we've been able to reach such incredible heights as a species and as civilizations, right? And from my perspective, that process is in a way irreversible without the consequence of a dramatic decrease in material living conditions paired with the reversal of that process. And to me, that is we've sort of been led down a path of globalization that it is almost impossible to revert on, right? At least from an individual person's perspective.
Yeah.
Because
we're dependent on the goods all around the world.
Right, and we're dependent on everybody else's knowledge because there's no way I would be able to live my life with the standard of living that I do now only using my own knowledge. I would never be able to build my washing machine and design my house and build my house and make my clothes and provide my food and do all of these things that it takes to provide the life that I live. I would never be able to provide all of that knowledge and know all of that knowledge on my own.
Yeah.
Instead, we've divided all of that knowledge that we hold collectively, right? So one person is really good at designing washing machines, and they probably work for Bosch, right, where my washing machine is from, right, and they do that job 5 hours a day, or 5 days a week, 9 hours a day, and I instead have knowledge on how to deliver food, right? I work for Postmates, so I know how to go to a restaurant and pick that food up and deliver that food to another house. Now, is that knowledge as hard to obtain as how to design washing machine? No, absolutely not. But me and that washing machine engineer in Germany have still divided up the knowledge that we share together. Now, my knowledge doesn't benefit him, but his benefits me.
Sure.
And so that has happened all across the world where we've divided up who knows what, and we've through various channels been able to share that knowledge and collectively benefit from that knowledge. And that is in a way an irreversible process where it would be nearly, I know I'm repeating myself, nearly impossible for me to gain that knowledge of the washing machine and also gain the knowledge of how to build a car or how to design a computer or how to make software to record a podcast. There's no way I could do all of those things. And so in order for me to continue to live the life that I'm used to, and in order for everybody to continue to live the lives that they're used to, we have to continue to rely on everybody else's knowledge, and we're doomed to be dependent on one another and living in this massive society. And the more used to material goods that we get, the further that dependency grows, and the stronger those bonds become, because if you look back at the quality of life of a French farmer, right? And I know that's always the example that I go to. They could make most of the things themselves. Most of the things that they consumed were either made by them and their family and passed down, right?
Or purchased at the local store.
And the people that provided those goods at the local store
Knew
all
how
lived
to
in
do
the
it
town,
themselves,
right?
sure.
The blacksmith made the hooves for the horseshoes for the horses, and it's the carpenter that made my table, right? And all
Sure.
of those things. But everybody is still within that town. So even though they are still specializing their knowledge, it's all within that town. Now, maybe one or two things come from outside of that town, like, the extra fancy, linenware that we wear on
Sure.
Sundays, right? That might come from Paris,
Sure.
right?
Or the salt that comes in
Exactly,
every once in a
that
while.
comes from the seaside. But pretty much everything is contained within the town in terms of knowledge that we have access to. So that town still had the ability to become independent as a town, right? The individual farmers didn't have the ability to become independent yet. As a town, they could have sectioned themselves off. We're a commune now. We still have enough knowledge to be relatively independent and still function and live at the same quality of life that we were before. Yet now, that potential has escaped us, right? One town in central Ohio doesn't have the capability and the knowledge collectively to maintain that skill, right? Nobody in that town in Ohio, right, knows how to make the plastic bags that Lay's chips come in, right? And nobody in that town knows how to manufacture tires, right? And nobody in that town has the ability to design smartphone software. They might be really good at farming, and they might be really good at pumping gas and building roads, but they don't have the collective knowledge in order to maintain their current standard of living.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we've sort of transitioned away from the ability to be an independent as individuals and as communities, and instead now our only potential independence is as countries. Right.
Yeah.
Yet even that is failing as countries become specialized, and countries that try to remain isolated and shield themselves from globalization become economically backwards and fall behind economies that choose to specialize and choose to modernize.
And there's problems with that.
Oh yeah.
The big problem is how there becomes a global economy, right? Because when you have a global economy, you get things like the Great Depression that happens. When one country fails, they all fail, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the worry, is that when you have these companies, or not companies, when you have these countries and their economic system fails, all the other countries that are dependent on that country will also fail, which is why you had, that's why you had massive problems in Germany. It's why you had massive problems throughout all of Europe when the stock market crashed in America, 1929. Yeah. So that's a big problem with having a global economy. But there's massive, there's great things that come from being globalized, such as having a much more comfortable lifestyle. Because now I can get spices from India that I can put in my soup here in America. I can go down the street and get Thai food or Indian food or whatever. Or, I can get any of the consumer goods that I have in my house right now from other countries. And
you can access almost every scientific paper ever written in history.
Exactly.
Ever, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. You can tap into that, right?
Exactly. That's and I think you hit on a very good point, which is all of this globalization comes from the discussion of ideas and communication, and the number one globalizer, I don't know if that's a word, but the number one
George Soros. We got to get him out of here.
George Soros. Oh man, I saw an Alex Jones. I won't get into the Alex Jones bit.
A little bit. Yeah.
Sure, but the main globalizer, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if that's a word or not. Is the smartphone and
the internet as a whole. Yeah.
The internet as a whole has helped globalize, all countries.
Yeah.
Because now I can see what's happening in Libya, or I can see what's happening in Russia.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's sort of two parts to this sort of technology sharing that we've done collectively, right? And one is sort of the direct sharing of knowledge, right? And that's sort of the, when you read a scientific paper written by somebody else, you've now gained access to the knowledge that person had, right? Or if you go to school, you listen to a lecture, that professor's knowledge has now been transferred into your head, right? And so that's one powerful way that the internet has revolutionized knowledge sharing, is that anybody can have access to all of this knowledge that people can put on the internet. So that means that if you're sitting alone in your house and you don't know how to do this math problem, you can go onto YouTube and there's an Indian person that knows how to do it perfectly and is able to explain it in 4 minutes. It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
Now, 50 years ago, you would have had to rely on the knowledge of your parents pretty much, and maybe your math teacher, the library, your neighbors, right? That's all the knowledge you had access to. Yet now we've access to all the knowledge that anyone chooses to put out into the world. So that's one way knowledge is transferred, and one way the knowledge revolution has happened is just the direct transfer of knowledge, and as we build up those information superhighways, everybody across the world is able to share knowledge at a much higher rate and utilize knowledge that comes from one part of the world all over the world.
Yeah, and it's super important, in all fields of study, right? When you're trying to develop mathematics, when you're trying to learn something new about math, the only way you do that is by getting the information of all the mathematicians, right? Taking that information and developing something new from them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's super important with all fields of study, right? It takes communication, right? If I want to learn something new in philosophy, I have to go back throughout the philosophers and try and develop their ideas into something new. And it takes the discussion of ideas to do that, right? Since you could look at the internet as a massive expansion on like the Gutenberg press, for instance. Although it's probably even more impactful than the Gutenberg press.
Not only because the technology itself could be spread so much faster, right? Because the Gutenberg press, I guarantee you, it took several hundred years for that to reach, the tip of South America, right? And for everybody in the world to have access to a printing press. However, the internet, it only took a couple of decades for almost everybody in the world to have potential access to all of the knowledge in the world, right? And so this brings us to the second type of way that people benefit from knowledge being shared and specialized is that we indirectly benefit, right? Even though you and I have no idea how to make a microphone, we're still able to benefit from someone knowing that, right? And that's why we're here doing this podcast. You and I don't know how to make this software. We don't know how to make a computer.
Absolutely.
We don't know how to make these microphones. We don't even know how to make the microphone stands, right?
Yeah.
We don't know how to make anything in here, right?
Sure.
But what we do know is how to talk for 3 hours, and so we're able to rely on the specialization of others, right, and benefit from their knowledge, and further utilize our specialization, right, and do our own sort of specialization, and by spending 3 hours a week talking to each other, right, as opposed to having to spend 20 hours a week building and designing all this stuff and only being able to talk for half an hour. Yeah, I don't know. So that's.
I just think it's really cool.
It's really interesting.
It's
right?
really interesting. It's really cool. I don't know.
Let's try to look at the potential downsides then. I mean,
like I said, the potential downside is when you have a world that's so dependent on each other. When one piece of the puzzle, gets taken away, when one Jenga piece gets flicked off, then the whole thing can tower down.
Yeah, definitely.
Because everyone's super reliant on each other for whatever they need.
Yeah, exactly. So by building this global world, we've threatened all of humanity, right? Because before a disease or an idea or a company collapse or a bad bureaucratic decision could affect, at maximum a country or a continent or, a big group of people. However, now that potential bad decision may potentially affect everybody in the world, right? Or a disease, the way coronavirus has, may affect everybody in the world.
Yeah, especially coronavirus. I didn't even think about that. Like, if you think about,
that's not necessarily about knowledge, but
about just spread of
people. That's a side effect of globalization.
Exactly.
Is that
people who
move.
are in businesses have to travel and meet other people.
Yeah, people move around. So I
don't know. I just thought about that.
I'm trying to think of. Okay. I'll let me pitch you this one. All right?
Sure.
I think that generally, we rely too much on these globalized, uber specialized systems to provide us our basic necessities. And I think that if we want to curtail the negative side effects of, sort of global collapses and global spirals downhill, if we're talking about disease or economic collapse or, a supply chain collapsing, we need to install fail-safes that would alleviate the worst effects of those potential collapses. And let me illustrate this, right? Let's look at the industry for ball bearings, right? Ball bearings are not a end consumer product traditionally, right? People like you and me are not going out to a supermarket and buying ball bearings in bulk, right? However, there are tons and tons of machines and robots that rely on ball bearings to operate, right? And there's a large global supply chain of companies that require ball bearings to continue their output, right? If you're making robotic arms for factories, you need to have ball bearings to make those robotic arms. And if you don't have those ball bearings, you might get screwed, right?
Yeah, if you're Walmart, you need your cashiers to hit the button and the thing slide down the whatever.
Exactly. And let's imagine for a second in this hypothetical. Now, this is not the reality, but in this hypothetical, the most efficient place because of location, geography, natural resources, whatever the factors are. The most efficient place to produce these ball bearings is in a region of Austria, right? In a high up mountainous region of Austria. There's lots of iron that can be produced into steel quickly. The labor is cheap. They've got good infrastructure connections, and it's generally cheaper for 90% of the world's ball bearings to be made in this area in Austria, right? There are some areas, right, maybe in remote places where it's actually more expensive to ship those ball bearings all the way to remote Kazakhstan as opposed to just making them in Kazakhstan, right? And in those places where it's actually more expensive, they will just make them domestically, right? But because the world is so globalized and shipping is so cheap and there's access to so many markets, 90% of the market is dominated by this Austrian area where it's just cheaper to make them there and ship them all over the world. Now, it is very specialized and it is very efficient, right? Everybody's able to get cheaper ball bearings by getting them from Austria than making themselves at home, right? However, let's imagine that something threatens that supply chain where there's a massive disease, right? And COVID breaks out in that area in Austria, and the government has to put into place, quarantine measures, right? And all those ball bearing workers have to go back home and not work at the factories for several months, right? Now all of a sudden, 90% of the world's ball bearings have been disrupted, and all of those companies across the world that rely on that supply chain have their are then impacted, right? Now, the companies that rely on them are also impacted. So all of the factories that are being built that are requiring these new robotic arms to be put in on this certain date at this certain time, now all of it, those things are pushed back, right? And so now all of these investments are going faulty because these factories aren't being constructed in time, right? So by having an interconnected web without fail-safes, we allow for the potential complete collapse of a supply chain, or the complete collapse of an economy, or the complete collapse of any of these interconnected systems. So a way that a government could alleviate that potential threat is by fostering some level of domestic industry while still allowing specialized industry to dominate the market.
This was a real threat in the United States when the whole coronavirus thing broke out, is that we didn't have enough pills stockpiled in America to keep, providing these pills for people who will die if they don't take their pills, right? Because the pills, most of the pills in the United States are manufactured actually in China, and shipped over to America. And so they thought, well, we're not going to be able to ship anything from China to the United States, and so I guess these people are going to die. That, like you said, it wasn't a proper fail-safe, and so in order to safeguard against something like that happening, you have to have some sort of domestic production at home.
Now, it doesn't have to be. Now, so I think that this is, now that we've got the core concept down, right, that we need to have a fail-safe, a safety net to catch those supply chains that are potentially threatened. I think that it's important to, sort of really identify what that would look like, right? I think that this is something that America has done using its trade policy extensively, right? If we look at the you brought up these medicine and these pills specifically, so let's show how America is failing to provide a fail-safe right now in that industry, right? And that's by allowing, let's say there's one specific drug that is only used by 1,000 patients in the world, right? 200 of them are in America to treat this very niche disease, and all of those pills are made in one small town in China, right? Because it's efficient, right? They have all the supply chains, all the chemicals that are put into those pills are provided for them cheaply right there. They've got everything that they need, and they're able to provide it way cheaper than anyone else in the world, right? And maybe they even got there first so that they have a running start ahead of everybody.
Sure. And it's not in the interest of the people who supply the pills to actually stockpile them.
Exactly, right? They want to get them out, ship them out fast as easy as possible, right? And now it's also in the best interest for all the people with that disease to buy those pills, right? Because if given an option between American homemade local pills and Chinese pills, the Chinese pills will be cheaper if it's more efficient to make them in China. And so those end patients will choose the Chinese pills. So the market will naturally push towards that specialization as patients choose to consume the cheapest pills, assuming that they're the same quality. Americans, the American government or American companies or NGOs could provide a fail-safe for the 200 American patients by investing in the potential to create those pills. Now, does that mean that that press needs to be running daily and that those pills need to be distributed and sold and it needs to be a viable, profitable company? Not necessarily, right? That is a tactic that the American government has taken. But we could just have the potential, right? We could just have an area that is just the pill making area, right? And they've got all the potential supplies and all of the chemicals necessary to make all of these pills that could be threatened, through supply lines. And it's only when we need them to switch on that they do switch on, right? That could be a way we do it. I'm not sure if that's the most efficient or cost-effective way to do that, to have a facility sitting, idling for 365 days a year, right? Or if it's better to have a bunch of different companies burning money, right, and losing profits and being not as efficient as the Chinese company. I don't know which one is more efficient. However, regardless of the way you look at it, in order to install these fail-safes, we're going to be spending money. Right. Yeah. And that's the real issue there is you would be diverting money from other potential sources like education, like, feeding children, like building homes, and instead spending it on, potentially useless things like having a big factory.
Sure. I mean, it's just like insurance. Right. Right. It's just like insurance. If you get in a car accident, you want to make sure that you're insured. If you never get in a car accident, then you wasted your money on buying insurance in the first place. Yeah. So it's just an insurance.
It's insurance, exactly. But there's actually another tactic that the American government has been utilizing for a long period of time now, and that's trying as hard as it can to give its domestic companies a competitive advantage. And that is sort of an uphill battle in my perspective, right? Because let's take the steel industry, for example, right? At the beginning of the 20th century, American steel dominated the globe, right? We produced steel incredibly cheaply in the Appalachians, right? Pittsburgh and West Virginia and all throughout the Appalachians.
Yeah, Andrew Carnegie, right?
Steel towns, right? That just cranked out all these beams, and they were sent all over the country and all over the globe and built these massive skyscrapers. And the American steel industry was flourishing, right? American steel dominated, right? So we didn't have to worry about our steel supply lines getting messed up because they were in Pennsylvania, right? No matter what, it's within our control, and it doesn't matter what happens in China because it's all right here, and we don't have to worry about our steel getting cut off by something that happens in China. However, if you look at the situation right now, China produces about 70% of the world's steel, right? Which is even crazier when you realize that China has no iron in its country. There's no iron in China, and iron is the one ingredient you need to make steel. So China has developed a domestic steel industry that is so against the market and that is against the market, yet it's still so much cheaper than American steel that they're able to dominate 70% of the global steel market. Isn't that kind of crazy? Like the fact that
where do they get the steel?
Australia. They get iron from Australia and they turn it into steel in China.
Jeez.
And it's actually it's the cheapest steel in the world right now. It gets more expensive the farther you bring it, right? Because steel is real heavy, so it is cheap to buy steel in Guangzhou, but it's more expensive to buy it in South Africa if it's Chinese steel.
It's probably expensive to refine it as well.
Yeah, but in China, steel is cheaper than cabbage, right? Like it's so incredibly cheap. So right now, the American steel industry is having trouble competing, right? Because to make American steel is way more expensive than it is to make Chinese steel. And even when you include the shipping costs there, Chinese steel often still has a competitive advantage. So that means even if someone's building a factory in Mexico, right, on the American border, it's cheaper to ship steel from China all the way across the Pacific and use it in that factory than it is to bring it just on a train from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so what does America have to do?
What does America have to do?
They have to raise the price of the steel coming in.
Exactly. And so we, instead of choosing to, maintain a domestic steel industry artificially, right, and simply having those steel plants that are subsidized and they're just
die off,
ready to go, like as a national security thing, right, so that we're able to make steel if we wanted to, and just having those inefficient plants be empty. Instead, we've tried our hardest to make sure that those steel plants still have a competitive advantage within our own country, right, and we've tried our hardest to make sure that is extended to other countries as well. But it has been an uphill battle, and in the process, we've hurt other American industries, right? By artificially increasing the price of steel, construction becomes more expensive, and anyone else that relies on steel in the American economy is hurt because of the artificial prioritization of the American steel industry, which could be avoided through the use of a fail-safe industry, right? And I haven't said it this whole time, but America's using tariffs, right? That's the way we're trying
Tariffs,
to
yeah.
support our own domestic industry, is by making sure that Chinese steel shipped into America is really expensive, and it might even be more expensive than American steel, right?
Yeah.
So that just overall raises the cost of steel for everyone in America and makes it so that we're not consuming as much steel as would be efficient, right?
But tariffs do have their benefits as well.
Right, from the perspective of the American steel industry, right? Obviously, they like it, right? But as an American person that has to buy tons of other goods that's not just steel, all of those prices get raised up because of a steel tariff.
It's the same thing with cars as well.
Yeah, same thing with cars, right? Even buying a burger, right? It's got no steel in it. It's nothing to do with steel. Yet it will raise that price because to get that burger into your mouth, someone had to buy steel, right? To build the restaurant, to build the trucks, to build the roads, right? Everything that it took to get that burger into your mouth relied on steel. And by raising that price, you're raising the end price of every consumer product. So I think that if we really want to take a look at how do we navigate this field of specialization of knowledge, how much do we allow our industries to be outsourced externally, how much do we try to maintain domestically, we really need to look at it from a utilitarian perspective of yes, propping up the domestic steel industry is beneficial for America and especially the steel industry itself, right? It's good that, for Bethlehem itself, the city, to have Bethlehem Steel operational because it employs half the population. However, is the benefit provided to that half of that city equal or greater than the total suffering borne by the American people as a result of the increase in the cost of all consumer goods as a result of the increase in cost of steel required to keep that Bethlehem steel afloat? Bad sentence, I know, real convoluted, but you understand what I'm saying.
I do understand.
Yeah, like we have to weigh those benefits and that suffering, and if it means that the total cost borne by the American consumer is over $1 billion, and that tariff could be replicated, and that factory could be kept alive with $50 million worth of subsidies, then $50 million worth of subsidies is a better deal for the American people as a whole. Not the steel industry maybe necessarily, right? But for the American people as a whole, if it is a better decision, then we should make that decision.
It would make my hamburger cheaper.
Exactly. We shouldn't put the priorities of small industries that are localized above the priority of the American people as a whole. That's the sort of path that leads to our unequal society.
You also have to consider that the money is staying within America and the money is not going out to other countries as well. And the money gets recirculated throughout the economy as well.
Right, but the same thing would happen
if
you're just spending money in America, right? If you're just subsidizing a factory, you're spending money in America, right? I don't know. You want to wrap it up, or you want to keep going?
That's about it.
That's all. Yeah.
I feel like we had well, I don't know. I think when it comes to America's foreign policy, we always want to do what's not what's best for the American public, just the people in America, but more so what is good for the investors and what's good for the business owners.
Right, and the political donors.
And the political donors, yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what's America's interests are when it comes to foreign affairs. And so, it'd be great if, like you said, if we could take the steel industry and, not put massive tariffs on incoming steel from China, but instead just let the Chinese and the Americans battle it out over steel and let them compete, and exactly. It would drive prices down. And I don't know. There's a lot of inefficiencies within our government.
Yeah.
But we probably can't solve them in the garage. We can only talk about it.
Exactly.
All right. Well, this has been the Outlet Podcast with Gabe and Eric. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. If you made it up to this point, we love you.
We love you.
Give us a like and a subscribe.
Yeah, comment. Let us know what you thought. If we said anything that was dumb or wrong, let us know. We want to hear it.
We definitely said things that were dumb and wrong.
Yeah.
So, we just join the discussion. We'd always we want to hear what you guys have to say.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening.
Thanks for listening.